Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. 3 Years of Silence. Clark Callahan stood in his workshop, running his hand across the smooth surface of a mahogany table he'd spent 3 weeks restoring. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting amber light across the wood grain. At 42, he'd found a strange peace in the silence of his work, a peace that had eluded him for 3 years. 3 years since Valerie died. The official report said drowning. A late-night drive along the coastal highway, the car found nose down in the ravine, Valerie's body pulled from the rocks below. They said she'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Clark had never believed it. Valerie was the most careful driver he knew, and she'd called him just an hour before, her voice bright and excited about a discovery she'd made at the historical archives in Portland. "Dad, you here?" Clark looked up to see his daughter Alexis standing in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 23, she had her mother's sharp green eyes and analytical mind. She'd graduated from Berkeley last year with a degree in digital forensics and now worked for a private investigation firm in Sacramento. "Hey, sweetheart. Didn't expect you today. I was in the area, thought I'd stop by." She walked over, examining the table. "This is beautiful. Museum piece. Private collector. Some tech billionaire in San Francisco wants it for his study." Clark wiped his hands on a rag. "You eaten?" "I was about to make dinner. Actually, I can't stay. I've got to drive back tonight. Early meeting tomorrow." Alexis hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "But I wanted to ask you something. Do you remember Mom mentioning anything about a storage unit? Like, one she might have rented privately?" Clark's hand stilled. "No. Why?" "I was going through some of her old files, digital stuff I'd backed up before we cleared out her office. I found a payment confirmation for a unit in Eugene. Monthly charges, paid up for 5 years in advance. The payment was made 2 weeks before she died." The workshop suddenly felt colder. "You have the address?" "Yeah, but it's weird. I called the facility, and they said the unit's under a different name. Miranda Ellis. I tried to get them to let me see it, but they need authorization from the account holder." Miranda Ellis. The name hit Clark like a physical blow. It was Valerie's grandmother's maiden name, something only close family would know. "When did you find this?" "Last week. I've been trying to track down more information, but..." Alexis trailed off, studying her father's face. "You look pale. Are you okay?" Clark forced himself to breathe normally. "I'm fine. Just surprised. Your mom never mentioned it." "I know. It's strange." Alexis checked her watch. "Listen, I really have to go, but I'll keep digging, see what I can find." After she left, Clark stood in the empty workshop, his mind racing. Valerie had been a historical researcher, specializing in Pacific Northwest history and genealogy. She'd made her living tracking down lost documents, verifying provenance of antiques, and helping families piece together their heritage. 2 weeks before her death, she'd been working on something that had made her excited enough to call him from the road. He'd never found out what it was. The police had returned her personal effects, but her research files were gone. Her laptop, her external drives, even the notebooks she carried everywhere, all missing. The detective had suggested they'd been lost in the crash, despite the fact that her purse and phone were recovered intact. Clark locked up the workshop and headed into the house. It was a craftsman-style home they'd restored together, every detail a collaboration. The empty rooms still echoed with Valerie's presence. The books she'd arranged on the shelves, the botanical prints she'd hung in the hallway, the antique globe that had been her prized possession. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom and pulled a box from the back of his closet. Inside were the items the police had returned: Valerie's phone, her wedding ring, her wallet. He'd never been able to make himself go through them properly. Now, he dumped the contents onto the bed and began examining everything with fresh eyes. The phone was dead, the battery long drained. He plugged it in and waited. When it finally powered on, he entered Valerie's passcode, their anniversary. The phone had been wiped clean remotely. Factory reset. He checked the wallet. Credit cards, driver's license, a photo of Alexis at her high school graduation. Nothing unusual, but tucked into a hidden slot behind the credit cards, he found something he'd missed before, a small key with a number stamped on it. 237. Clark turned the key over in his palm. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was smaller, brass, the kind used for a safe deposit box or a storage locker. His phone rang, startling him. Unknown number. Hello. Silence on the other end, then a click. The line went dead. Clark stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. Wrong number, probably, but something about it felt off. He spent the next hour trying to trace the storage unit, but without the account holder's authorization, he hit a wall. Finally, frustrated, he decided to drive to Eugene himself. It was a 3-hour drive, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Valerie had left him a message, one he was only now beginning to understand. Chapter 2. The Laptop. Clark was packing a bag for the trip to Eugene when his phone buzzed. A text from Alexis. Dad, I think I left my work laptop at your place. On the counter by the door? I need it tonight. He checked. Sure enough, a sleek black laptop sat on the kitchen counter. He texted back, got it. Want me to drop it off somewhere? No, I'll swing by in the morning before work. Just don't let anyone mess with it. Confidential client files. Understood. See you tomorrow. Clark set the laptop aside and continued packing. He'd leave first thing in the morning, check the storage unit, then meet Alexis when she came by. He was closing his overnight bag when a laptop on the counter chimed. He froze. The sound was distinctive, an incoming video call. Clark walked slowly to the counter. The laptop screen had lit up, showing an incoming call from an unknown ID. His finger hovered over the touchpad. This was Alexis's work laptop. He shouldn't answer, but something compelled him to click. The screen flickered, and then an image resolved. Clark's heart stopped. On the screen, in grainy but unmistakable detail, was his wife's face. Valerie looked directly at the camera. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones more pronounced, her blonde hair shorter and darker at the roots. But it was her. Those eyes. That slight scar above her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bike at 12. Valerie. His voice came out as a whisper. She opened her mouth to speak, but before any sound came out, the image shifted. The camera pulled back, revealing that Valerie was in a small, windowless room. Concrete walls. A single bulb overhead. Her hands were visible now, bound with zip ties to the arms of a metal chair. Then a gloved hand entered the frame, covering the camera lens briefly. When it moved away, the angle had changed. The camera now showed Valerie in profile, and standing behind her was a figure in a dark hoodie, face obscured. A voice came through the speakers, male, digitally distorted, mechanical sounding. Don't tell him you saw this. The figure behind Valerie leaned closer to the camera, and Clark caught a glimpse of a tattoo on the exposed wrist. 3 interlocking rings with a date beneath. August 15th, 19. If you involve the police, the distorted voice continued, she dies. If you tell your daughter, she dies. You have something we want, Mr. Callahan. Check your email. You have 48 hours. The screen went black. Clark stood frozen, his hands gripping the counter so hard his knuckles had turned white. His mind screamed 2 impossible truths. Valerie was alive, and she'd been captive for 3 years. He grabbed the laptop, his hands shaking, and opened the email application. It was password protected, but he forced himself to think. He pulled out his phone and called Alexis. Hey, Dad, everything okay? I need you to walk me through accessing your laptop. There's something I need to check. Dad, I told you, it's got confidential. Alexis, please. Something in his voice must have convinced her. She guided him through a workaround that let him access the guest browser. He opened his own email. There, at the top of his inbox, was an unmarked message sent 3 minutes ago. No subject line. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a message. The photograph showed a document. Old, yellowed paper with elaborate calligraphy. Clark recognized it immediately. It was a land deed dated 1847, signed by Territorial Governor Joseph Lane. He'd seen it once before, 3 years ago, when Valerie had called him from Portland, breathless with excitement. I found it, Clark. The Whitmore deed. This proves everything. The land rights, the inheritance claim. This is going to make history. The email message was brief. You know what this is. You know where the original is. Bring it to the coordinates below within 48 hours. Come alone. No police. No tricks. When we have the deed, you get your wife back. Below was a set of GPS coordinates. Clark's mind raced. The Whitmore deed. Valerie had been researching the Whitmore family for months before her death. The Whitmores had been one of Oregon's founding families, granted massive land parcels by the territorial government. But the family had died out in the early 1900s, or so everyone thought. Valerie had discovered that there was a surviving heir, a descendant through a female line that had been overlooked. If the original deed could be found, it would prove ownership of nearly 2,000 acres of prime Portland real estate, land currently occupied by shopping centers, apartment complexes, and office buildings. Land worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dad, are you still there? He'd forgotten Alexis was on the line. I'm here. Listen, I need you to stay where you are tonight. Don't come by tomorrow morning. What? Why? What's going on? I can't explain right now. Just trust me. I'll bring your laptop to you tomorrow afternoon. Dad, you're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry. I just need you to stay safe. He paused. I love you, sweetheart. He hung up before she could respond. Clark stood in his kitchen, the laptop screen glowing before him, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. For 3 years, he'd been drowning in grief. For 3 years, he'd blamed himself for not being there, for not protecting Valerie, for not seeing whatever danger had been coming. Now he knew the truth. Valerie hadn't died. She'd been taken. Someone had staged the accident, faked her death, and kept her prisoner, all for a piece of paper that would make them wealthy beyond measure. And they expected him to simply hand it over and trust they'd release her. Clark pulled out his phone and began making calls. Not to the police, they'd said no police, but to people who owed him favors, people with particular skills. If they wanted to play games, he'd play, but not by their rules. By the time the sun rose, Clark Callahan would be ready for war. Chapter 3. The Hunter Awakens. Clark didn't sleep. He spent the night in his workshop, not working on furniture, but assembling something else entirely. A map of connections, a web of possibilities, a strategy for the impossible. The first call had been to Kent Humphrey, a former military intelligence officer who'd retired to Eugene and now ran a private security consulting firm. Clark had helped Kent restore his grandfather's roll-top desk 2 years ago, and they'd stayed in touch. Kent had the kind of resources and contacts that didn't appear in any phone book. I need information on a kidnapping, Clark had said without preamble. 3 years old. Victim presumed dead. Captors are professionals. You know you should call the FBI. Can't. They've made threats. A pause. How sure are you about this? I saw her on a video call 30 minutes ago. Another pause, longer this time. Give me the details. Clark had spent an hour walking Kent through everything. Valerie's research, the Whitmore deed, the staged accident, the video call. Kent had listened without interruption, taking notes. I'll make some calls, Kent had said finally. But Clark, if these people are sophisticated enough to fake a death and keep someone hidden for 3 years, they're not going to just hand her back when you deliver the deed. You know that, right? I know. So what's your play? I'm working on it. Now, as dawn broke over the Cascade foothills, Clark sat at his workbench examining the photograph of the Whitmore deed. The problem was simple. He didn't have the original document. Valerie had found evidence that existed, had traced it to a private collection, but as far as Clark knew, she'd never actually gotten her hands on it. So either the kidnappers didn't know that, or they believed Clark had access Valerie didn't. His phone buzzed. Kent, I've got preliminary information. The accident report on your wife's death has some irregularities. The investigating officer was Solomon Perkins, 20-year veteran. He retired 8 months after closing the case and moved to Hawaii. Bought a house for cash, $800,000, well above his pension grade. Clark's jaw tightened. He was paid off. Looks like it. I'm trying to track down the coroner who signed the death certificate, but she's proving harder to find. Name's Crystal Underwood. She left the medical examiner's office 6 months after your wife's case and hasn't worked in Oregon since. So we got at least 2 people involved in the cover-up. At least. But here's what's interesting. I pulled property records for Perkins's Hawaii house. It was purchased through an LLC, and that LLC traces back to a holding company owned by Dwight Wong. The name meant nothing to Clark. Ooh, real estate developer. Made his fortune flipping commercial properties in the Pacific Northwest. He's worth north of $400 million. But here's the thing. About 5 years ago, he started buying up properties in Northwest Portland. Shopping centers, office parks, residential complexes. He paid premium prices, way above market value. Then, 3 years ago, the buying stopped. Right around the time your wife disappeared. Clark felt pieces clicking into place. He knew about the deed. He was buying the properties before anyone could challenge his ownership. That's my guess. If the Whitmore heirs surfaced with the original deed, Wong would lose everything. We're talking $250 million in real estate that wouldn't legally belong to him. So he had Valerie killed, or thought he did. But why keep her alive? Insurance, Kent said. Maybe he needed her expertise to verify the deed when he found it. Or maybe she told him she'd hidden it somewhere, and he's been trying to extract the location. Either way, you've got a problem. Wong's not going to let either of you walk away from this. Clark had already reached that conclusion. Can you give me an address? For Wong. I can. But Clark, this guy has resources. Private security, lawyers, connections to people you don't want to mess with. You go after him directly, you're dead. Then I won't go after him directly. Clark hung up and turned to his computer. He pulled up everything he could find on Dwight Wong. Property holdings, business ventures, associates, habits. The man kept a relatively low profile despite his wealth, avoiding the society pages and charity galas that usually attracted people of his status. But everyone had weaknesses. Everyone had pressure points. Clark found Wong's first vulnerability in a 3-year-old article from a Portland business journal. Wong had been embroiled in a legal dispute with a former business partner named Reginald Schmidt over a deal that had gone south. Schmidt had accused Wong of fraud, claiming Wong had deliberately tanked a property development to buy it cheap and flip it for profit, cutting Schmidt out of millions. The case had been settled out of court, terms undisclosed. Reginald Schmidt. Clark pulled up everything he could find. The man had been a successful developer in his own right before the dispute with Wong. After the settlement, Schmidt had fallen on hard times, bankruptcy, foreclosure, a messy divorce. He disappeared from Portland society about 2 years ago. But people didn't just vanish. They left traces. Clark spent the next 3 hours tracking those traces. Social media posts, property records, business registrations. Finally, he found it. Schmidt had reinvented himself as a business consultant and was living in a modest apartment in Salem, about an hour south. The second call was to Jonah Duffy, a private investigator Clark had met through his restoration work. Jonah had been helping an elderly client track down stolen family heirlooms, and Clark had authenticated several pieces. Jonah was good at finding people who didn't want to be found. I need you to locate someone, Clark said, and I need it done quietly. Can you do that? Depends on the someone. Reginald Schmidt. Lives in Salem. I need an address and a phone number, and I need to know if he's clean or if he's got any outstanding warrants. I can have that for you by noon. What's this about? Better you don't know. By midday, Clark had what he needed. Schmidt's address, his phone number, and, most importantly, the knowledge that the man had a serious gambling problem and was in debt to several questionable lenders. Clark made the drive to Salem. Schmidt's apartment complex was a rundown collection of 2-story buildings arranged around a cracked parking lot. Clark found the unit number and knocked. The man who answered looked nothing like the confident businessman from the articles. Schmidt was in his 50s, graying and gaunt, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd seen better days. He wore sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. Reginald Schmidt? Who's asking? My name's Clark Callahan. I want to talk to you about Dwight Wong. Schmidt's expression went from suspicious to hostile. I got nothing to say about that bastard. Even if I told you I could help you get revenge. Schmidt studied Clark for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. You got 5 minutes. Inside, the apartment was sparse. Furniture that looked like it came from thrift stores, empty beer bottles on the counter, the smell of stale cigarettes. Schmidt gestured to a worn couch, and Clark sat. Wong destroyed my life, Schmidt said without preamble. He stole from me, lied about me, and when I tried to fight back, he buried me in legal fees until I had nothing left. So yeah, I'd love revenge. But unless you've got a magic wand, I don't see how that happens. I don't have a magic wand, Clark said, but I have information. Wong is involved in something criminal, something that could put him away for a long time. I just need help proving it. Schmidt laughed, bitter. You think I haven't tried? Wong's bulletproof. He's got judges in his pocket, lawyers on retainer, and enough money to make problems disappear. He doesn't have me. And who are you? Someone he hurt badly. Someone who's going to make sure he pays for it. Clark leaned forward. 3 years ago, Wong orchestrated the kidnapping of my wife. He faked her death, bribed officials to cover it up, and has kept her prisoner ever since. All because she discovered evidence that could cost him hundreds of millions of dollars. I've got 48 hours to deliver that evidence, or they kill her. I don't plan to let either of those things happen. Schmidt's eyes had gone wide. Jesus Christ. I need information on Wong's operation, where he keeps his security, who he trusts, where his vulnerabilities are. You worked with him. You know how he thinks. I did, but that was years ago. People don't change their patterns. Help me take him down, and when this is over, I'll make sure you get a piece of whatever comes from it. Money, vindication, whatever you want. Schmidt was quiet for a long time. Then, Wong's got a compound outside of Portland. 15 acres, gated, security cameras everywhere. He keeps his private files there, the stuff he doesn't want anywhere near his legitimate businesses. If your wife's being held captive, that's where she'd be. How do I get in? You don't. Not without an army. But Schmidt hesitated. Wong's paranoid. He doesn't trust anyone completely. So he keeps insurance, files on everyone he works with, evidence he can use if they ever turn on him. I know because he tried to use it on me. It's all kept in a safe in his study. What kind of evidence? Financial records, recorded conversations, blackmail material. If he's holding your wife, there'll be proof of it in that safe. The question is how you get to it. Clark thought for a moment. Does he still have the same security company he used when you were partners? Far as I know, Apex Security, run by a guy named Trevor Larson. He's loyal to Wong because Wong pays him twice what anyone else would. Everyone's loyalty has a price, Clark said. What's Larson's? Schmidt smiled grimly. Now you're thinking like Wong. They talked for another hour, Schmidt laying out everything he knew about Wong's operation, his habits, his weaknesses. By the time Clark left, he had the beginnings of a plan. It was risky. It was probably illegal. And it definitely wasn't the kind of thing a furniture restorer should be attempting. But Clark Callahan wasn't just a furniture restorer anymore. He was a man who'd been given a second chance to save his wife. And he wasn't going to waste it. Chapter 4. Allies and Enemies. Clark drove back to Eugene with Schmidt's information burning in his mind. The compound, the safe, Trevor Larson, each element was a piece of a larger puzzle. But he needed more than information. He needed people. Taking down someone like Dwight Wong required a team, and Clark had exactly 36 hours left before the deadline. His first stop was Kent Humphrey's office. Kent listened without interruption as Clark laid out what he'd learned from Schmidt, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. You're talking about breaking into a secured compound, cracking a safe, and stealing evidence from a man who's already demonstrated he's willing to kill, Kent said when Clark finished. That's not a rescue operation. That's a suicide mission. You have a better idea? Yeah, go to the FBI. Give them everything you've got. Let them handle it. And if Wong gets spooked and kills Valerie before they can move? Or if he's got connections inside law enforcement, who tip him off? Clark shook his head. I can't take that risk. Kent leaned back in his chair, studying Clark with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent decades making life-or-death decisions. You've changed. 3 years ago, you would have called the cops immediately. 3 years ago, I thought my wife was dead. I spent 1,000 nights wondering if there was something I could have done differently. I'm not making that mistake again. Ken was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone. I know a guy. Former Delta, now freelance security consultant. He specializes in high-risk extractions, corporate kidnappings, hostage situations in foreign countries. He's expensive, and he doesn't ask questions. Can he do it in 36 hours? If anyone can, it's him. Kent dialed. But Clark, you need to understand something. Once you start down this path, there's no going back. You'll be committing multiple felonies. If this goes wrong, you're not just losing Valerie. You're losing everything. I already lost everything 3 years ago. I'm just getting it back. 20 minutes later, Clark was meeting with Seth Massey in the back room of a gun range Ken owned. Massey was in his early 40s, compact and muscular, with the kind of stillness that suggested coiled violence. He listened to Clark's explanation with the same professional detachment a surgeon might show examining an X-ray. Apex Security, Massey said when Clark finished. I know them. Good outfit. Larson runs a tight ship. Getting past them isn't impossible, but it'll require precision. Can you do it? Depends on your budget and your timeline. For what you're describing, compound penetration, potential hostage extraction, evidence retrieval, you're looking at $100,000. Half up front, half on completion. Clark didn't hesitate. Done. I can wire you $50,000 today. Massey raised an eyebrow. That was fast. I don't have time to negotiate. I need to know if you can do this by tomorrow night. Tomorrow night? For the first time, Massey's professional mask slipped, showing surprise. That's not enough time for proper recon. It's all the time we have. Massey exchanged a glance with Kent, then turned back to Clark. All right, but we do this my way. I'll need to see the compound today, identify entry points, map security protocols. And I'll need at least one other person, someone to run over watch while I'm inside. I'll do it, Clark said. No offense, but you're a furniture restorer. This requires combat training. Then I'll be the distraction. Wong, and as people think I'm going to show up at their coordinates with the deed. I'll do that. Draw them away from the compound while you go in. By the time they realize they've been played, you're out with Valerie and whatever evidence we need. Massey considered this. That actually might work. But you understand you'll be walking into a trap with no backup? Not no backup. You said you need someone for Overwatch. I know someone. The someone was Jonah Duffy, the private investigator. When Clark called, Jonah was initially skeptical. You want me to do what now? Surveillance and communications. You've got the equipment, the experience with stakeouts. I just need you to watch my back while I meet with these people. Clark, I'm an investigator, not a mercenary. I know, but you're also a former Marine sniper. Kent told me. A pause. Kent talks too much. Will you help or not? Another pause, longer this time. How much does this pay? 20,000. Half now, half after. And you're sure about this? About the kidnapping? I saw her, Jonah. She's alive, and she's being held captive. I can't let this happen to anyone else, and I can't trust the police with this. Please. Finally, send me the details. I'll be there. With his team assembling, Clark turned his attention to the next problem, the Whitmore deed. The kidnappers expected him to deliver it, but he didn't have it, which meant he needed to figure out where it actually was or create a convincing fake. Clark drove back to his workshop and pulled out Valerie's research files, the ones he'd managed to recover from her cloud storage. She'd been meticulous in her documentation, creating detailed notes about every lead she followed. The Whitmore deed had last been confirmed in the possession of a man named Paris Maldonado, an eccentric collector of Pacific Northwest historical documents. Valerie's notes indicated she'd arranged to meet Maldonado 2 days before her death, but there was no record of whether that meeting had actually happened. Clark looked up Maldonado's information. He lived in Portland, in one of the old neighborhoods near Washington Park. Clark made the drive, arriving at a Victorian house with overgrown gardens and peeling paint. He knocked on the door. The man who answered was in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair and suspenders holding up worn corduroys. Can I help you? Mr. Maldonado? My name is Clark Callahan. I'm Valerie Callahan's husband. I believe you knew her. Maldonado's face went pale. Valerie? Yes. Terrible thing. What happened to her? Such a brilliant researcher. Can I come in? I need to ask you some questions about the last time you saw her. Maldonado hesitated, then stepped back. Of course. The interior of the house was exactly what Clark expected. Books and papers everywhere, artifacts on every surface, the organized chaos of a collector. Maldonado led him to a cluttered study. I was devastated when I heard about the accident, Maldonado said. Valerie was one of the few people who truly understood the importance of preserving these documents. She came to see you, didn't she? 2 days before she died. She was asking about the Whitmore deed. Maldonado's expression became guarded. She did, but I didn't have it anymore. I'd sold it 6 months earlier. Clark felt his heart sink. Sold it to whom? A private buyer. He paid well, very well, but he insisted on anonymity. All the negotiations went through lawyers. Was the buyer's name Dwight Wong? Maldonado looked startled. I don't know. The purchase was handled through an LLC. But he trailed off, then stood and walked to a filing cabinet. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a folder. Here, the sale documents. Maybe you can trace it better than I could. Clark took the folder, scanning the papers inside. The LLC was called Cascade Holdings, and the registered agent was a law firm in downtown Portland, Watkins & Associates. Did Valerie seem upset when you told her you'd sold the deed? Not upset, determined. She said she needed to find the buyer, that it was crucial. She asked me for any information I had about the sale. Maldonado paused. There was something else. After she left, I remembered something I'd forgotten to tell her. There was a second deed. Clark looked up sharply. What? The Whitmore land grant was split between 2 brothers, Marcus and Samuel Whitmore. Most historians know about Marcus's deed, the one I sold. But Samuel received a separate grant, smaller but still substantial. That deed disappeared in the 1890s. I told this to Valerie when she called me the day of her accident, just a few hours before. Well, she said it changed everything. Why would a second deed matter? Because it meant the heir would have claimed even more land, and it meant anyone trying to suppress the claim would need to find both deeds, not just one. Maldonado looked at Clark intently. Mr. Callahan, why are you asking about this now, after 3 years? Clark made a decision. Because I don't think Valerie's accident was an accident. And I think whoever killed her did it because of those deeds. Maldonado sat down heavily. My God, you're saying she was murdered. I'm saying I'm going to find out the truth. Do you have any idea where the second deed might be? No, but Valerie was onto something. She said she'd found a reference to it in the Portland archives in a collection of letters from the 1880s. If anyone could have tracked it down, it was her. Clark stood. Thank you for your time, Mr. Maldonado. And if anyone comes asking you these same questions, don't tell them what you told me. Should I be worried? I hope not. But be careful. Back in his car, Clark sat with the folder, his mind working through the implications. There were 2 deeds. Wong had purchased one, presumably to destroy it or hide it. But if Valerie had found the second deed, or found evidence of where it was, that would have been the real threat to Wong's empire. Which meant the kidnappers didn't just want a deed. They wanted the specific deed that Valerie had been searching for. The one they didn't have. Clark pulled out his phone and called Kent. I need you to get me into the Portland archives. Tonight. After hours. That's breaking and entering. Add it to the list. Can you do it? A sigh. I'll make some calls. 2 hours later, Clark was standing outside the Portland City Archives building with Kent and a nervous-looking young woman named Lacey Snyder, who worked as an assistant archivist. Kent had convinced her to let them in with a story about time-sensitive genealogical research, backed by a substantial cash incentive. You've got 2 hours, Lacey said, unlocking the door. After that, the security system resets and flags any motion inside. They made their way to the research room, and Clark pulled up the collection Maldonado had mentioned, the Whitmore family papers, letters, and documents from the 1880s. He started going through them systematically, looking for any mention of Samuel Whitmore or his land grant. An hour in, he found it, a letter dated March 1887, from a Portland lawyer to Samuel Whitmore's widow. The letter referenced the deed and associated documents currently held in trust pending resolution of the estate. The trust was managed by Portland Territorial Bank, an institution that had ceased to exist in 1891. But banks didn't just disappear. They merged, were acquired, changed names. Clark spent another 30 minutes tracking the lineage of Portland Territorial Bank through various incarnations until he found that its assets had eventually been absorbed by Columbia Trust, which still operated in Portland. I need to get into Columbia Trust, Clark said. Their document archives. If the deed was held in trust, there might be a record of where it ended up. Kent looked at his watch. Our 2 hours are almost up, and even if we could get into Columbia Trust, We need authorization to access their historical archives. Then we get authorization, or we break in. Clark, Kent, I've got less than 24 hours. I don't have time to do this the right way. I need that deed, or at least proof of where it is. Otherwise, when I walk into that meeting tomorrow, I'm as good as dead. Ken was quiet for a long moment, and he pulled out his phone. Let me make a call. I might know someone who owes me a favor at Columbia Trust. But Clark, you need to think about what happens after tomorrow. Even if we get Valerie back, even if we get evidence against Wong, you're still going to have to deal with the consequences of what you're doing. I'll worry about consequences after Valerie's safe. They left the archives and Clark drove home, exhaustion beginning to creep in. He hadn't slept in 30 hours, running on adrenaline and coffee. But he couldn't stop now. Back at his house, he found a message waiting on his phone. Unknown number, text only. Your time is running out, Mr. Callahan. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., coordinates we sent. Come alone. No tricks. Clark texted back. I'll be there. Have the deed. He didn't, but he would. One way or another. Chapter 5, The Double Game. The next morning, Kent's contact at Columbia Trust came through. Fletcher Marquez was a senior vice president who'd worked with Kent during a fraud investigation years ago. After some persuasion and a carefully edited version of the truth, Marquez agreed to let Clark access the historical trust documents. I'm only doing this because Kent vouches for you, Marquez said, leading Clark through the bank's lower levels to a climate-controlled archive room. But if anyone asks, you were never here. The records from Portland Territorial Bank had been digitized, but the original documents were still maintained. Clark spent 3 hours going through boxes of century-old papers, his fingers careful with the fragile pages, his eyes scanning line after line of ornate handwriting. Finally, he found it. Samuel Whitmore's deed, dated 1847, granting him 1,100 acres south of the Columbia River, east of the Willamette, encompassing the territory from Morrison Creek to Powell Butte. The original deed had been held in trust until 1923, when it was released to a descendant named Eleanor Whitmore Davies. After that, the trail went cold. But clipped to the trust documents was a note, dated 1958, from an attorney representing the Davies estate. Original deed and territorial survey maps transferred to personal collection, to be maintained with family documents. The Davies family. Clark pulled out his phone and started searching. Eleanor Whitmore Davies had one daughter, Trudy Davies, who married and became Trudy Watkins. Trudy was still alive, living in a retirement community in Beaverton. Clark thanked Marquez and rushed out. He made the drive to Beaverton, his mind racing. If Trudy Watkins still had the deed, or knew where it was, that would explain why Valerie had been targeted. She must have tracked down the same connection. The retirement community was pleasant and well-maintained, with manicured gardens and comfortable common areas. Clark checked into the front desk and asked to see Trudy Watkins. Mrs. Watkins is in the activity room, the receptionist said. She's expecting someone today, actually. You can go right through. Expecting someone? Clark felt a prickle of unease, but continued. The activity room was empty except for an elderly woman sitting by a window, a blanket over her lap. She looked up as Clark approached, her eyes sharp despite her age. Mrs. Watkins? I'm Clark Callahan. I was hoping to ask you some questions about your family history. The Whitmore deed, Trudy said, surprising him. You're the second person this week to ask about it. Clark's blood ran cold. Who was the first? A man named Dwight Wong. He came 3 days ago, said he was a historian writing a book about territorial Oregon. But I could tell he wasn't really interested in history. He wanted the deed. Did you give it to him? Of course not. I don't have it anymore. I sold it years ago, 1995 to be precise. A man offered me $50,000 for it. At the time, that seemed like a fortune. I used the money to move into this facility. Who bought it? I don't remember his name. It was handled through a lawyer. But I remember the man himself came to inspect it first to make sure it was authentic. He was young then, maybe 30. Very intense. He kept saying it was a piece of history that needed to be preserved. Clark pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of Dwight Wong from a news article. Was this the man? Trudy leaned close, studying the image. No, the man who bought it was different. Thinner, darker hair. But she hesitated. When Mr. Wong was here, he had an assistant with him. That assistant looked familiar. I think he might have been the one who actually purchased the deed back then. Can you describe the assistant? Tall, maybe 6'2". Shaved head. He had a tattoo on his wrist. I noticed it because my grandson has the same one. 3 rings with a date underneath. Clark's hands went numb. 3 interlocking rings, the same tattoo he'd seen on the video call. The person holding Valerie captive had purchased the deed 25 years ago, which meant this conspiracy ran far deeper and longer than Clark had realized. Mrs. Watkins, did you tell Wong where the deed might be now? I told him what I'm telling you. I don't know. The man who bought it said he was a collector, that it would be kept safe. That's all I cared about. Do you remember anything else about him? Any detail? Trudy thought for a long moment. He had a scar. Right here. She traced a line from her left ear to her jawline. Like he'd been cut with something. Clark thanked her and left, his mind reeling. The man with the tattoo had bought the deed in 1995, before Dwight Wong became wealthy. Which meant either Wong had been planning this for decades, or the man with the tattoo was the primary player and Wong was just a partner, or a tool. Clark called Kent. I need you to find someone. Male, 6'2", shaved head, scar from left ear to jawline, tattoo of 3 interlocking rings with a date, August 15th, 19, on his left wrist. Purchased historical documents in Oregon in 1995. That's not much to go on. It's all I have. Can you run it through your databases? I'll try. But Clark, we're running out of time. It's 2 p.m. You're supposed to be at those coordinates in 6 hours. I know. How's Massey doing with his recon? He's at the compound now, posing as a utility inspector. Says security's tight, but manageable. He thinks he can get in through a maintenance access on the east side. But he'll need at least 90 minutes once you draw Wong's people away. He'll have it. What about Jonah? He's setting up Overwatch position now. He got a clean sight line to the meeting coordinates. If things go south, he can provide cover for your extraction. Good. I'm coming back to Eugene. I need to prepare. Clark drove back, but his thoughts kept returning to the man with the tattoo. Who was he? What was his connection to Dwight Wong? And why had he purchased the Whitmore deed a quarter-century before it became valuable? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Clark was pulling into his driveway, his phone rang. Reginald Schmidt. I've been thinking about what you said. Schmidt began without preamble. About Wong and the kidnapping. There's something I didn't tell you yesterday. Someone I forgot about. Who? Wong has a fixer. Guy he uses for problems that need to disappear. I only met him once, years ago, but he scared the hell out of me. He handled some zoning issue Wong was having. The details don't matter. What matters is this guy wasn't just muscle. He was smart, strategic, and he's been with Wong since the beginning of his business, maybe longer. What's his name? I never knew his real name. Wong just called him Larson. Clark's mind connected the pieces. Trevor Larson? The security company owner? No, different guy. I mean, there might be a connection. Wong's security is run by Trevor Larson. But the fixer was someone else. Had a scar on his face. Always wore long sleeves, even in summer. The man with the tattoo. Schmidt, I need you to think. Did Wong ever mention how he knew this man? Where he came from? Not that I remember. But wait, there was one thing. Wong mentioned once that they'd grown up together, that they went way back. He said something about owing the guy his life. Childhood friends turned business partners. One became a real estate mogul, the other became his enforcer. And together, they've been planning this scheme for decades, quietly acquiring properties, waiting for the moment when they could eliminate the last obstacle to their empire. Valerie had been that obstacle. Clark thanked Schmidt and hung up. He had 4 hours until the meeting. 4 hours to finalize his plan, coordinate with his team, and prepare for a confrontation that would likely end with someone dead. He went into his workshop and pulled out the items he'd assembled. A GPS tracker, a voice recorder, copies of everything he'd found about the Whitmore deed, and a letter he'd written to Alexis, to be opened only if he didn't return. His phone buzzed. A text from Kent. Massey's ready. Jonah's in position. Your move. Clark texted back, heading out in 30 minutes. He had one more call to make. He dialed Alexis. Dad, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day. I know. I'm sorry. Listen, I need you to do something for me. What's going on? You've been acting strange since. Alexis. His voice was firm. I need you to listen. Tomorrow morning, I need you to go to Kent Humphrey's office in Eugene. He's going to have some documents for you. If I don't call you by 9 a.m., I need you to take those documents to the FBI field office in Portland. Ask for Special Agent Terrence Thomas. Tell him everything. Dad, you're scaring me. What's happening? I can't explain right now, but I need you to promise me you'll do this. I promise, but I love you, sweetheart. Remember that. Whatever happens, remember I love you. He hung up before she could respond. Clark loaded his truck and headed for the coordinates the kidnappers had sent. They were in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, an hour northeast of Portland. Remote, isolated, perfect for an ambush. But Clark wasn't walking into this blind. As he drove, he activated the voice recorder in his pocket and called Seth Massey. I'm en route. You have the compound location. Confirmed. I'm 30 minutes out. Once you've engaged them, I'll move in. Remember, Valerie's your first priority. Get her out, then grab whatever evidence you can from the safe. Understood. And Clark, don't be a hero. You make the trade, you stall as long as you can, then you get clear. We've done our part. You don't need to die for this. I'll keep that in mind. Clark drove into the mountains as the sun began to set, the sky turning gold and orange. The coordinates led him to a logging road that cut through dense forest. He followed it until he reached a clearing with an abandoned ranger station, its windows boarded up, its parking lot cracked and overgrown. Two vehicles were already there, a black SUV and a white van. Clark parked and got out, his heart pounding. The clearing was silent except for the wind in the trees. He checked his phone. No signal. The door of the ranger station opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, shaved head, scar from ear to jawline. The man from the video call. Mr. Callahan, the man said, his voice natural now, not distorted. You're punctual. I appreciate that. Where's my wife? She's safe. For now. Did you bring the deed? Clark held up a document case. It's here, but I want to see Valerie first. The man smiled. That's not how this works. You give me the deed, I verify it's authentic, then you get your wife. Those are the terms. And I'm supposed to just trust you'll honor them? You don't have a choice. Behind the man, the van's side door slid open. Two more men stepped out, one of them holding a rifle. Clark stood his ground. I want proof she's alive. Right now. The man with the scar considered this, then pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen and held it up. On it, Clark could see Valerie, still bound to the chair but alive. She looked directly at the camera. Clark, she said, her voice weak but clear. Don't. The man ended the video. Satisfied? Now give me the deed. How do I know you won't kill us both once you have it? You don't. But you're out of options. Hand it over or I'll put a bullet in your wife's head and dump both your bodies in the woods. This can end two ways, Mr. Callahan. Choose wisely. Clark took a deep breath. Everything depended on the next few minutes. If Massey couldn't get to Valerie in time, if Jonah couldn't provide the cover he'd need to escape, this was it. He stepped forward, holding out the document case. The man with the scar took it and opened it. Inside were documents, historical papers, careful forgeries Clark had created using samples from the Portland archives. They'd pass a cursory inspection, but wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny. But they didn't need to. They just needed to buy time. The man studied the papers, his expression focused. Behind him, the other two men had moved closer, their attention also on the documents. Clark's phone, tucked in his pocket, was recording everything. The GPS tracker in the document case would lead authorities here if things went wrong. And 30 miles away, Seth Massey was breaking into Dwight Wong's compound to free the only person in the world Clark couldn't live without. The man with the scar looked up. These are impressive forgeries, Mr. Callahan, but they're not the real deed. Clark's blood turned to ice. The man smiled. Did you really think we wouldn't verify? We've had experts examine copies of the original. These papers are close, but not close enough. He pulled out a gun. I gave you a chance to do this the easy way. Now we do it my way. You're going to tell me where the real deed is, or I'm going to start cutting pieces off your wife. And when I'm done with her, I'll start on your daughter. Time seemed to slow. Clark saw the gun rising, saw the other men moving to flank him, saw his carefully constructed plan disintegrating. And then, from the tree line, came the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Chapter 6. Blood and Iron. The man with the rifle went down before he could even register what was happening. A second shot, and the other gunman collapsed, clutching his shoulder. Jonah Duffy was earning his $20,000. Clark dove behind his truck as the man with the scar, now identified as the real threat, fired 3 rapid shots in the direction of Jonah's position. But Jonah had already moved, his military training evident in the way he'd set up multiple firing positions. "You brought backup," the man snarled at Clark. "That was stupid." "No," Clark said, pulling his own weapon, a 9mm he'd purchased legally that morning. "What was stupid was thinking I'd come here defenseless." He hadn't wanted to shoot anyone. Violence wasn't in his nature. But these men had stolen 3 years of his life, had tortured his wife, had threatened his daughter. They'd turned him into something he'd never been before. They turned him into someone who could kill to protect his family. Clark fired twice. The first shot missed. The second caught the man with the scar on the thigh, and he went down cursing. Clark ran forward, kicked the gun away, and stood over him. "Where is she? Where's Valerie?" The man laughed, blood seeping through his pants. "You think you've won? Wong has her at the compound. By now, he knows something went wrong. He's probably putting a bullet in her head as we speak." Clark's world tilted. Massey was supposed to have 90 minutes. But if Wong had been alerted, his phone buzzed. Signal had returned. A text from Seth Massey. Complications. Wong was here. Engaged. Extracting now. "What's your name?" Clark demanded, pressing the gun to the man's head. "Go to hell." Another text. "Have target. Multiple hostiles. Need exfil now." Clark looked at the wounded man. "You're going to give me Wong's security codes. Right now. Or I leave you here to bleed out. And if I give them to you, you'll let me live? No promises. But your odds are better than they are right now." The man seemed to calculate his chances. Then, painfully, he rattled off a series of numbers. Gate codes, security system, overrides, safe combinations. Clark recorded everything on his phone, then used the man's own zip ties to secure his hands and feet. He did the same with the wounded gunmen, using their belts as tourniquets to keep them from bleeding out completely. "That man you shot," Clark said, gesturing to the dead gunman. "He have family? Does it matter?" "Yeah, it does. Because unlike you, I'm not a murderer. He made his choice. You made yours. But I need to know who I've killed." The man with the scar laughed bitterly. "You really are an amateur." He was nobody. Hired muscle from Seattle. Wong picked him up for this job. No family, no connections. Nobody's going to come looking. Clark felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd killed a man, even if in self-defense, even if justified, it would never leave him. But he couldn't think about that now. He called Jonah. "I need you to watch these two until the police arrive. I'm heading to the compound." "Clark, that's insane." "You should. I know what I should do. But Massey's got Valerie, and he's under fire. I'm not leaving them." Clark ran to his truck and peeled out, leaving Jonah to secure the scene. The drive to Wong's compound took 38 minutes at speeds that would have gotten him arrested under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. He used the codes the man had given him to get through the gate. Alarms should have sounded, but the system accepted the override. The compound was massive, 15 acres of landscape grounds surrounding a modern mansion that looked like something from an architecture magazine. Clark could see signs of a firefight, bullet holes in walls, broken windows, a security guard lying motionless near the garage. His heart hammered as he ran toward the main house. A figure emerged from the shadows, Seth Massey, carrying someone over his shoulder. "Valerie." "Clark, what the hell are you doing here?" "Helping." "Is she okay?" "Sedated but alive. Wong's men caught me on the way out. We need to move now." Gunfire erupted from the house. Massey shoved Valerie into Clark's arms. "Get her to my vehicle. It's parked on the access road, west side. I'll cover you." "What about Wong?" "Already dead. I had no choice. He came at me with a gun. The evidence is in my pack. Now go." Clark ran, carrying Valerie's unconscious weight, his muscles screaming. Behind him, he heard Massey returning fire, the sharp bark of his rifle steady and professional. He found Massey's vehicle, a nondescript SUV, and gently laid Valerie in the back seat. She was breathing steadily, her pulse strong. Tears burned Clark's eyes as he looked at her face, older and thinner than he remembered, but undeniably alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Massey appeared, breathing hard. "They're down. We need to go before more show up." They drove. Massey took back roads, avoiding main highways, his driving smooth despite the circumstances. Clark sat in back with Valerie, holding her hand, barely able to believe she was real. "The compound?" Clark asked. "Evidence secured. I got into Wong's safe before things went bad. Financial records, recorded conversations, photos. Everything you need to prove the conspiracy. Plus I found something else, a confession. Video recording of Wong explaining the whole scheme to his lawyer. Insurance, probably, in case the lawyer ever turned on him. It's damning. And Wong, dead, like I said. Self-defense, clean shoot. But Clark, you need to understand, this isn't over. That man at the ranger station, whoever he is, he's not the only one involved in this. Wong had partners, investors, people who benefited from keeping the Whitmore deed suppressed. When this goes public, there's going to be blowback. Let them come. I've got my wife back. That's all I care about." Valerie stirred, her eyelids fluttering. "Clark, I'm here. You're safe. The deed? Samuel's deed. I hid it. She'll rest. We'll figure it out." "No. Listen." Her voice was weak but urgent. "I knew they were coming for me. I hid the deed where only you would think to look. Our anniversary. The place we got engaged. Under the..." She faded out again. Clark's mind raced. Their anniversary. The place they got engaged. That was Crater Lake at the rim overlook. But what had been there? They'd been hiking, had stopped for lunch, had... The old fire watchtower. 20 feet from where he'd proposed, there was an abandoned fire watchtower that they'd explored. Valerie had loved it, had said it was romantic in a decrepit way. She'd hidden the deed inside. "I know where it is," Clark said. "I know where she hid it." Chapter 7. The Revelation. Valerie slept for 18 hours, her body recovering from whatever cocktail of sedatives Wong's people had been giving her. Clark sat beside the bed in the safe house Kent had arranged, watching her breathe, still half convinced this was a dream. When she finally woke, really woke, her eyes cleared and focused on him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Valerie started crying. Clark held her, and she held him, and neither spoke for several minutes. Some things didn't need words. When they finally separated, Valerie's first question was, "Alexis? She's safe. She doesn't know everything yet, but and the people who took me?" Clark's expression hardened. "Dead or in custody. It's over, Val. Wong, dead. His security chief, too. The man who actually held you. The one with the scar. He's in federal custody now. Kent made sure of that. He's singing like a bird, giving up everyone involved in the conspiracy." Valerie closed her eyes. "His name is Melvin McDaniel. He and Wong grew up together in Portland in the foster system. They were like brothers. When Wong started making money in real estate, McDaniel was his enforcer, handled the dirty work, intimidated rivals, made problems disappear." "How long were you investigating them before they grabbed you?" 6 months. I didn't know it was Wong at first. I was just following the trail of the Whitmore deed. But the more I dug, the more I realized someone was actively suppressing any information about the Whitmore heirs. Property titles being altered, genealogical records going missing, researchers being bought off or threatened. When I finally connected it to Wong, I knew I was in danger. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was going to. I'd found Samuel Whitmore's deed, verified its authenticity. I was planning to bring it to you that night, have you hide it somewhere safe. But they got to me first." She touched his face. "They kept me in that room for 3 years, Clark. 3 years. Sometimes they'd bring me up to verify documents, to help them track down other potential heirs. They wanted to make sure no one could ever challenge Wong's holdings. How did you survive? I kept telling myself you'd figure it out, that you'd never believe I'd just died in an accident, that you'd keep looking." Her voice broke. "But 3 years is a long time. I started to think maybe you'd moved on. Maybe you'd given up. Never. I never stopped looking. I just didn't know where to look. Valerie managed a weak smile. And now you found me. But Clark, we need to get that deed. It's the only physical proof that validates everything else. Without it, Wong's partners could claim the digital evidence was fabricated. I know where it is. Crater Lake. The old watchtower. You remembered. How could I forget? Best day of my life until today. Kent appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a problem. The FBI wants to talk to you both. Special Agent Terrence Thomas is outside. Clark tensed. What does he want? To take your statements and to offer you a deal. The Bureau is prepared to grant you immunity for any laws you broke in the course of rescuing Valerie, in exchange for your full cooperation in prosecuting Wong's associates. And if we don't cooperate, then you're looking at charges for breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and potentially murder, depending on how the shooting at the ranger station plays out. Clark looked at Valerie. She nodded. Let's talk to them. Agent Thomas was in his 50s, with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He listened without interruption as Clark and Valerie walked him through everything. The kidnapping, the conspiracy, the real estate fraud, the evidence they'd gathered. When they finished, Thomas sat back. This is one of the most elaborate criminal conspiracies I've encountered in 30 years. We're talking about dozens of people involved, lawyers, officials, security personnel. Wong had his fingers in everything. So you believe us? Clark asked. I do. We've already started arresting people based on the evidence Mr. Massey turned over. But I need that deed. Physical evidence will make the case airtight. We'll get it for you, Clark said. But I have conditions. You're not really in a position to negotiate. No, I'm a man who just handed you the biggest corruption case in Oregon history. I think I've earned the right to make some requests. Thomas smiled slightly. Fair enough. What do you want? Full immunity for everyone who helped me. Kent Humphrey, Seth Massey, Jonah Duffy, Reginald Schmidt. They broke laws to help me, and I won't let them pay for that. Done. What else? Protective custody for my daughter until this is resolved. And I want your word that when this goes to trial, Valerie won't be treated like a victim who needs to be saved. She's a survivor. She's a hero, and she deserves to be recognized as such. Thomas extended his hand. You have my word. Now let's go get that deed. The drive to Crater Lake took 5 hours. Clark drove with Valerie beside him, the FBI following in 2 vehicles. It felt surreal. After 3 years of grief and 3 days of violence, they were finally together again, driving through the mountains like they used to. Valerie was quiet for most of the drive, processing everything. Finally, she said, I heard you during those 3 years. Sometimes McDaniel would leave his phone on when he came to check on me, and I could hear him talking. He mentioned you a few times, said you were asking questions, poking around. It gave me hope. I should have found you sooner. You found me. That's what matters. And Clark, what you did, assembling that team, risking everything, I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. I killed a man, Val, at the ranger station. I shot him, and he died. In self-defense. Protecting me. That's not murder, that's love. It doesn't feel like love. It feels like I crossed a line I can't uncross. Maybe, but you came back from it. You're still you, still the man who cares about whether that gunman had a family, still the man who wants to make sure his friends don't face consequences for helping him. That's who you are, Clark. Don't let one act of necessary violence change that. They reached Crater Lake as the sun was setting, the water impossibly blue against the surrounding cliffs. Clark led the group to the old fire watchtower, a rickety structure that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. You hid it in there? Thomas asked dubiously. She hid it somewhere that would mean something to us, but that no one else would think to look. Clark climbed the tower carefully, the wood creaking under his weight. At the top was a small observation room, its windows broken, its floor littered with debris. He and Valerie had carved their initials in the wall during that visit 15 years ago. Clark found the carving, CC plus VM, with a heart around them. Below it, Valerie had carved 4 numbers, their anniversary date. Clark counted floorboards from the north wall, using the numbers as coordinates. The 4th board was loose. He pried it up. Inside the hollow underneath was a metal document tube, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. Clark pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a sheet of parchment, yellowed with age, covered in elaborate script. The Whitmore deed, signed by Joseph Lane himself. "I'll be damned," Thomas said when Clark brought it down. "She actually found it." "She always finds what she's looking for," Clark said, smiling at Valerie. "That's why I married her." Chapter 8. Reckonings. The trial began 4 months later. Melvin McDaniel, facing life in prison, had indeed sung like a bird, as Kent had predicted. His testimony revealed a conspiracy that stretched back 30 years and involved over 40 people. Everyone from real estate developers to government officials to lawyers and bankers. The courtroom was packed. Clark sat in the gallery with Alexis, watching as Valerie took the stand. She'd recovered well from her ordeal, putting on weight, her color returning. But there was a hardness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. The prosecution walked her through her captivity in clinical detail. The isolation, the threats, the constant fear. The way McDaniel and Wong had used her expertise to help them track down and eliminate any evidence of the Whitmore heirs. "They kept me alive because I was useful," Valerie testified. "The moment I stopped being useful, I knew they'd kill me. So I gave them just enough information to keep them searching, but never enough to actually find what they were looking for." "Why didn't you tell them where you'd hidden the deed?" the prosecutor asked. "Because that deed represented justice for the Whitmore family. They were cheated out of their inheritance, erased from history. I wasn't going to let that happen, even if it cost me my life." When the defense cross-examined her, they tried to suggest she'd been a willing participant in Wong's schemes, that her captivity was fabricated. Valerie destroyed them. "If I was a willing participant," she said coldly, "why did Dwight Wong try to kill my husband at that compound? Why did Melvin McDaniel keep me chained to a chair for 3 years? Why did they stage my death and terrify my family?" The defense had no answer. McDaniel's testimony was even more damning. He described in detail how he and Wong had orchestrated Valerie's kidnapping, forcing her car off the road, drugging her, placing her belongings in a staged accident scene. He explained how they'd paid off Officer Solomon Perkins to file a false report, and how they'd pressured medical examiner Crystal Underwood to sign off on a body that wasn't actually Valerie's. "Whose body was it?" the prosecutor asked. "A Jane Doe from a Seattle morgue," McDaniel said flatly. Wong paid a funeral director to substitute it. The family held a closed casket funeral. No one ever knew. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. But the most damaging testimony came when McDaniel explained Wong's ultimate plan. "Once we had all the documentation, once we were sure there were no other heirs, we were going to kill Valerie and her husband. Make it look like a murder-suicide. The grieving widower who couldn't handle his wife's return, or something like that." Wong had it all planned out. Clark felt Alexis grip his hand. She'd been devastated to learn the truth about her mother's death, angry that Clark had kept her in the dark during the rescue. But she'd eventually understood. And now, hearing how close they'd both come to dying, she seemed to be processing it all over again. The trial lasted 6 weeks. In the end, Melvin McDaniel received life without parole. The various lawyers, officials, and accomplices received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. Solomon Perkins, the corrupt police officer, got 15 years. Crystal Underwood, the medical examiner, got 10. But the biggest revelation came during the sentencing phase, when the judge ordered the return of the disputed properties to their rightful owner. That owner turned out to be Flora Everett, an 86-year-old retired teacher living in Eugene. She was Samuel Whitmore's great-great-great-granddaughter, and until Valerie's research surfaced, she'd had no idea about her family's history. When informed that she was now the owner of land worth approximately $340 million, Flora's response was characteristically practical. "Well, I suppose I can finally fix the roof." She used the money to establish the Whitmore Foundation, dedicated to preserving Oregon history and supporting genealogical research. Valerie was offered the position of executive director. She accepted. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 1 year after Valerie's rescue, Clark stood in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a custom dining table. It was made from reclaimed Oregon black walnut, the grain figured and beautiful, the joinery invisible. It was some of his best work. Valerie appeared in the doorway. That's gorgeous. Who's it for? Us. I figured after everything we've been through, we deserve a table big enough for the family dinners we're going to start having. Family dinners? Alexis is moving back to Eugene. She got a job with the FBI's digital forensics unit here. She'll be working with Agent Thomas. Actually, turns out he was impressed with her skills. Valerie smiled. That's wonderful. She told me yesterday she's bringing someone to Thanksgiving. A boyfriend, apparently. I heard. Kent's son of all people. Small world. Small town, anyway. Clark set down his tools and wiped his hands. There's something else. Seth Massey called. He's retiring from the extraction business. Wants to know if we need a security consultant for the foundation. Do we? Probably not. But I told him we'd find something for him. He saved your life. That's worth something. He saved both our lives. As did Kent and Jonah. We owe them everything. I know. Which is why I set up trust funds for each of them. From Flora's reward money. They all tried to refuse, but I insisted. How much? Enough that they don't have to worry for a while. Clark paused. I also donated a substantial amount to a fund for the families of law enforcement killed in the line of duty, including the family of that gunman I shot. Turns out he did have a sister. She's raising his 2 kids on her own now. Oh, Clark, I know it doesn't make up for it, but it's something. They stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. After a moment, Valerie said, "Do you regret it? What you did to save me." "No. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people died. But I don't regret getting you back. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, even knowing what it cost. Especially knowing what it cost. Because now I know what you're worth. What we're worth. And it's more than any amount of money or property or a clean conscience. You're everything, Val. You always were." She kissed him, and for a moment, everything was perfect. Later that evening, they drove to Alexis's new apartment for dinner. She decorated it with a mix of modern furniture and family heirlooms, including the antique globe that had been Valerie's prized possession, which Alexis had carefully preserved during the 3 years she'd thought her mother was dead. Alexis's boyfriend turned out to be Kent's younger son, Trevor, no relation to Trevor Larson, the security company owner who was currently serving 15 years for his role in the conspiracy. This Trevor was a software engineer, earnest and kind, clearly devoted to Alexis. They sat around Alexis's small table, too small, but that would change when Clark's custom table was finished, and shared a meal. For the first time in years, Clark felt something like peace. "To family," Alexis said, raising her glass. "The ones we're born with and the ones we choose." "To family," they echoed. Later, as Clark and Valerie drove home through the Eugene night, Valerie said, "I never asked you. When you thought I was dead, during those 3 years, did you ever think about moving on? Finding someone else?" "Never. Not once. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew. You don't spend 20 years with someone and not recognize when the story doesn't make sense. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for staying alive. For fighting. For hiding that deed where I'd find it. We make a good team. The best." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Clark said, "Flora wants to commission a series of display cases for the foundation. Historical documents, artifacts, that sort of thing. She asked if I'd be interested in doing the woodwork." "Are you?" "I think so. Seems fitting somehow. Preserving history, making sure these stories don't disappear. Like the Whitmore story almost did." "Exactly." They pulled into their driveway. The house looked welcoming in the porch light, warm and solid. Clark had spent the last year restoring it properly, fixing all the little things that had been neglected during his grief. It felt like home again. As they climbed the steps to the front door, Valerie stopped. "Clark, there's something I need to tell you." His heart skipped. "What?" "During the trial, while I was testifying, I realized something. Those 3 years in captivity, they changed me. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm harder now, more cynical, less trusting. That's understandable. But I don't want to be that person. I don't want what they did to me to define the rest of my life. So I've been seeing a therapist, working through the trauma. And it's helping, but it's hard." Clark took her hands. "We'll do it together. Whatever you need, however long it takes. We'll do it together. Promise." "Promise." Inside, they found a bottle of wine and sat in the living room, the house quiet around them. Valerie curled into Clark's side, and he held her, marveling at the simple fact of her presence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked after a while. "That video call. When I first saw your face on that screen, I thought I was losing my mind. That grief had finally broken me, and I was hallucinating. But you weren't. No, you were alive. You've been alive the whole time. And I've been mourning you for nothing. Not for nothing. You mourned because you loved me. That's not nothing. That's everything." They sat in silence, watching the fire Clark had built in the fireplace. Finally, Valerie said, "Do you think it's really over?" "All of it. The trials are done. Wong's dead. McDaniel's in prison. The foundation is established. What else is there? I don't know. I keep expecting something else to happen. Another threat, another revelation. It feels too easy. Val, you were held captive for 3 years. I shot a man. We exposed a massive conspiracy and sent dozens of people to prison. Nothing about this was easy. I know, but we won. The good guys won. That doesn't happen in real life. Sometimes it does. Sometimes justice actually works. Sometimes the person who keeps fighting, who refuses to give up, who does the hard thing even when it's terrifying, sometimes that person wins." Valerie smiled. "You've become quite the philosopher. I've had time to think. 3 years of it. What else did you think about during those 3 years?" "Honestly, revenge. I spent a lot of time imagining what I'd do if I found out you hadn't died in an accident. The people I'd hurt, the things I'd destroy. But you didn't. You saved me instead. Only barely. If McDaniel had played it smarter, if Wong had been more careful, if any of a dozen things had gone differently, you'd still be in that room. Or worse. But I'm not. I'm here. We're both here. And we have the rest of our lives ahead of us." Clark pulled her closer. "I love you. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. I love you too. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for being the kind of man who'd risk everything to save me. Thank you for being worth saving." They sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, then climbed the stairs to bed. In the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, Clark felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Complete. The nightmares would come later. The trauma would take years to process. There would be hard days ahead, days when Valerie couldn't get out of bed, days when Clark woke up convinced it had all been a dream and she was really gone. But they'd face those days together, because that's what marriage meant. Not the vows you spoke on your wedding day, but the promises you kept when everything fell apart. The choice to keep fighting when fighting seemed impossible. The refusal to let go even when letting go would be easier. Clark had made those choices. So had Valerie. And now, finally, they'd earned their happy ending. Outside, the Oregon night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the darkness. Inside, two people who'd been torn apart by cruelty and greed held each other and dreamed of a future they'd almost lost. Some stories don't have happy endings, but this one did, and it had been earned, every single moment of it, with blood and tears and an unwavering refusal to accept defeat. The bad guys were punished. The good guys survived. Justice was served. And Clark and Valerie Callahan, against all odds, got to live the rest of their lives together. Epilogue. 5 years later, Clark Callahan stood at Crater Lake with his granddaughter. Alexis and Trevor had married 3 years ago, and their daughter, named Valerie after her grandmother, was 2 years old and endlessly curious. "Papa, what's that?" Little Valerie pointed at the old fire watchtower. "That's where I asked your grandmother to marry me, and where she saved us all." "Ow, that's a long story, sweetheart. I'll tell you when you're older." The real Valerie appeared, carrying a picnic basket. She'd aged gracefully, the silver in her hair making her look distinguished rather than old. The foundation had thrived under her leadership, and she'd become a respected voice in Pacific Northwest historical preservation. "Ready for lunch?" she called. Clark scooped up his granddaughter and walked to join his wife. Behind them, the lake reflected the sky, impossibly blue, unchanging. But everything else had changed. They'd been broken and put back together. They'd survived the worst thing that could happen to a family. And now they were building something new. Not just their own future, but a legacy for their daughter and grandchildren. As they spread the blanket and unpacked the food, Clark looked at his wife and smiled. She smiled back, understanding everything that smile meant. They'd won, and they'd earned every moment of their victory. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Guest. Troy Kellerman stood at his kitchen window, watching his 9-year-old son Cooper kick a soccer ball around their backyard. The Saturday afternoon sun cast long shadows across their pristine lawn in the suburban neighborhood of Millbrook Heights. Troy had worked hard for this life. The 2-story colonial house, the manicured lawn, the white picket fence that seemed to promise the American dream. His security consulting business had flourished over the past 5 years, built on the foundation of discipline and tactical expertise he'd gained during his 8 years in Special Forces. The doorbell's chime interrupted his thoughts. Cooper's ball rolled to a stop as the boy looked toward the house with curious eyes. Troy dried his hands on a dish towel and headed to the front door, his military-trained instincts automatically cataloging the details of the stranger standing on his porch. The man was tall, roughly Troy's height at 6'2", with dirty blonde hair and weathered hands that spoke of manual labor. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and his smile seemed genuine enough, but something about his posture suggested a nervous energy barely contained beneath the surface. "Afternoon," the stranger said, extending his hand. "Name's Wade Hartley. Just moved into the house 3 doors down, the blue Colonial. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself to the neighbors." Troy was about to respond when Cooper appeared in the doorway behind him. The boy took one look at Wade and froze, his face draining of color. Cooper had always been a social child, quick to warm up to new people, but now he pressed himself against Troy's leg with an urgency that immediately put Troy on alert. "Daddy," Cooper's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion Troy couldn't quite identify. "Tell him to leave." Troy frowned, glancing down at his son before looking back at Wade. "Cooper, that's not polite. Mr. Hartley is our new neighbor." But Cooper's reaction only intensified. His small hands clutched at Troy's jeans, and when Wade stepped closer with his hands still extended, the boy's eyes filled with tears. "Daddy, ask him where he lived before," Cooper said, his voice breaking with the kind of desperation that made Troy's protective instincts flare to life. Before Troy could process his son's strange behavior, footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. Brenna emerged from their bedroom, probably drawn by the voices. She'd been taking one of her frequent afternoon naps, something that had become a pattern over the past year. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and she wore the silk robe Troy had bought her for their 10th anniversary. The moment Brenna saw Wade, she stopped dead in her tracks. The color drained from her face so completely that Troy thought she might faint. Her green eyes went wide with what looked like terror, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture that seemed involuntary. "Brenna?" Troy's voice carried an edge of concern mixed with growing suspicion. "You okay, honey?" Wade's nervous smile faltered for just a moment as he looked between Brenna and Troy, but he quickly recovered. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle anyone. Like I said, just wanted to introduce myself. Wade Hartley." He gestured vaguely toward the street, the blue house with the black shutters. Brenna's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Cooper pressed even closer to Troy, and the boy's obvious distress was beginning to trigger every alarm bell in Troy's mind. In his military days, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. "Where did you live before?" Troy asked, his tone casual, but his eyes locked on Wade's face. For the briefest moment, less than a second, Wade's expression shifted. It was so quick that most people would have missed it, but Troy had been trained to read micro-expressions, to catch the tiny tells that separated truth from deception. What he saw in that fleeting instant was panic, quickly masked by practiced ease. "Phoenix," Wade said smoothly. Been there about 3 years. Before that, bounced around a lot with work. Construction and contracting, you know how it is. But Cooper shook his head violently. No, the boy whispered, tears now streaming down his cheeks. No, Daddy. He lived. Cooper, enough. Brenna's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and harsh in a way that made both Troy and Wade turn to look at her. She stepped forward, her face flushed now instead of pale, and placed a protective hand on Cooper's shoulder. Go to your room. Now. The boy looked between his parents with confusion and fear, but Troy nodded toward the stairs. Go ahead, buddy. We'll talk in a minute. Cooper reluctantly trudged upstairs, casting one last fearful glance at Wade before disappearing around the corner. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Wade cleared his throat. Kids, right? Sometimes they get confused about faces. Happens all the time. But his laugh sounded forced, and Troy noticed how his hands had formed loose fists at his sides. Right, Troy said slowly, his analytical mind already working through the possibilities. His son's reaction, his wife's obvious recognition of this man, the way Wade's story didn't quite ring true. It all pointed to something that made Troy's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. Brenna had recovered some of her composure, but Troy could see the tremor in her hands as she smoothed down her robe. Well, it was nice meeting you, Mr. Hartley, she said, her voice artificially bright. I'm sure we'll see you around the neighborhood. It was clearly a dismissal, but Wade seemed reluctant to leave. His eyes lingered on Brenna for a moment too long, and Troy caught the brief, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning gesture that confirmed every suspicion now forming in his mind. Absolutely, Wade said finally. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other. Looking forward to being part of the community. He stepped back from the doorway but paused, looking directly at Brenna. Maybe we'll run into each other at the grocery store or something. You know, catch up on old times. The phrase hung in the air like a threat, and Troy felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't a coincidental move to their neighborhood. Wade Hartley had come here deliberately, and from the looks that had passed between him and Brenna, Troy was beginning to understand why. After Wade left, walking with deliberate casualness toward his car, Troy closed the door and turned to face his wife. Brenna was already backing toward the stairs, her face pale again and her eyes darting everywhere except toward Troy's face. Brenna, Troy said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded a storm. We need to talk. Chapter 2. Unraveling Truths. Troy watched his wife pace their bedroom like a caged animal, her hands shaking as she lit her third cigarette in 10 minutes. She'd quit smoking 2 years ago, or so she'd claimed, but the pack of Marlboros had appeared from the depths of her jewelry box with practiced ease. His name is Wade Hartley, Troy said, settling into the chair by their window. His voice remained calm, controlled, the same tone he'd used during interrogations in Afghanistan. He says he's from Phoenix. Says he's in construction. He paused, watching Brenna's reaction. But you already knew all that, didn't you? Brenna took a long drag and exhaled slowly, the smoke creating a barrier between them. I don't know what you're talking about. Our son recognized him. A 9-year-old boy who's never been to Phoenix, who's barely been outside of Connecticut, somehow knows our new neighbor well enough to be terrified of him. Troy's hands remained relaxed in his lap, but his eyes never left her face. So, I'll ask again, how do you know Wade Hartley? The cigarette trembled between her fingers. Maybe Cooper saw him around town before. Kids notice things. Troy had spent 13 years with Brenna, from her college days at UConn through courtship, marriage, and Cooper's birth. He knew every one of her tells. The way she touched her neck when nervous. How she couldn't maintain eye contact when lying. The slight Connecticut accent that crept into her voice when she was under pressure. Try again, he said quietly. Brenna's composure finally cracked. She sank onto the edge of their bed, her head in her hands. Troy, please, can't we just let this go? He's here now, but that doesn't mean anything has to change. The admission hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting it. Troy had built his business on his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves, to stay 3 steps ahead of any threat. But somehow his own wife had been playing a game he hadn't even known existed. How long? The question came out flat, emotionless. "It's over," Brenna said quickly. "Whatever you're thinking, it's over. It has been for months." "How long?" She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Not just guilt, but defiance. As if part of her resented having to explain herself to him. 18 months, she whispered. Troy processed this information with the same methodical approach he used for tactical planning. 18 months ago, Brenna had started working late more often. Started taking those afternoon naps. Started suggesting that Cooper spend more weekends at her mother's house. All of it made sense now. "Where did you meet him?" "Troy, please." "Where?" "The gym." She took another drag, her hands steadier now. "He was working on the renovation project at Fit First." We started talking. Fit First was Brenna's upscale gym downtown, the one where she spent 3 hours every Tuesday and Thursday. Troy had encouraged her membership, thinking the exercise was helping with her postpartum depression that had lingered long after Cooper's birth. He'd even been proud of how dedicated she'd become to her fitness routine. And Cooper knows him because... Brenna's silence stretched for nearly a minute before she answered. "Wade came to a few of Cooper's soccer games. I told Cooper he was a friend from work." The betrayal cut deeper than Troy had expected. Not just the affair, but the way she'd involved their son. Made Cooper complicit in her lies. Made the boy shake hands with his mother's lover and pretend everything was normal. "Why did he move here?" Troy asked. "I don't know." But her voice lacked conviction. Troy stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He walked to their bedroom window and looked out at the neighborhood he'd worked so hard to afford. The tree-lined streets, the well-maintained homes, the promise of security and stability he'd wanted to provide for his family. "You're lying," he said without turning around. Wade Hartley didn't randomly choose Millbrook Heights. He didn't randomly choose a house 3 doors down from us. He came here for a reason. Behind him, he heard the bed creak as Brenna stood up. "Troy, I swear to you, I had no idea he was moving here. When I ended things with him 6 months ago, I thought that was it. I thought he understood." Now Troy turned around, and Brenna took an involuntary step backward at whatever she saw in his expression. 6 months ago, but you said 18 months total." "The affair lasted about a year," she said quickly. "I ended it 6 months ago when I realized what I was doing to our family. To Cooper. To you. But he didn't want it to end." Brenna's cigarette had burned down to the filter without her noticing. She stubbed it out in the ashtray she'd hidden in her nightstand drawer, another small deception that added to the growing pile. "He said he loved me," she whispered, "so we belonged together. But I told him it was over. I chose my family." Troy's laugh was completely devoid of humor. "You chose your family. After a year of fucking another man, you chose your family." He shook his head. "How generous of you, Brenna." "Troy, please. Does he know about Cooper's soccer schedule? About my business trips? About which nights I work late at the office?" The color drained from her face again. What kind of question is that? The kind of question a man asks when he realizes his wife has been sharing details about their family with someone who might not have the best intentions. Troy's voice remained level, but there was something underneath now, something cold and calculating that made Brenna wrap her arms around herself. "Wade wouldn't hurt us," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. A man who starts an affair with a married woman, then moves 3 doors down from her family when she ends it? Troy moved closer, and Brenna instinctively backed toward the door. "That's not the behavior of someone who's accepted rejection, Brenna. That's the behavior of someone who's escalating." Troy had seen enough obsessive behavior during his military service and his security consulting work to recognize the pattern. Wade Hartley hadn't moved to Millbrook Heights to start fresh. He'd moved here to continue something that Brenna thought she'd ended. "I need you to pack a bag," Troy said suddenly. "You and Cooper are going to stay at your mother's for a few days." "What? Why?" "Because I need time to think. And because until I figure out what Wade Hartley really wants, I don't want you or Cooper in this house." Brenna's defiance flared again. "You can't just kick us out of our own home." Troy looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd loved since they were 22 years old. The woman who'd promised to be faithful to him. The woman who'd built a double life so elaborate that she'd convinced their son to lie for her. "Watch me," he said quietly. As Brenna stormed out to pack, Troy remained by the window, his mind already working through possibilities. Wade Hartley thought he was dealing with an unsuspecting husband who could be manipulated or intimidated. He thought he was playing a game where he held all the cards. But Troy Kellerman hadn't survived 8 years in special forces by being anyone's victim. And he hadn't built a successful security business by backing down from threats. Wade Hartley had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And Troy was going to make sure he paid for it. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Preparation. Troy stood in his basement office, surrounded by the tools of his trade. 3 monitors displayed different search results, police databases, and social media profiles. His military training had taught him that information was the most powerful weapon, and after 48 hours of digging, he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of man had decided to insert himself into the Kellerman family. Wade Hartley, age 34, had been born in Tucson, Arizona. High school dropout at 16. Military service, Army, dishonorably discharged after 2 years for assault charges that had been quietly buried. Since then, a string of construction jobs across the Southwest, never staying in one place for more than 18 months. 3 restraining orders from 3 different women in 3 different states. The pattern was clear. Wade was a predator who specialized in married women. He would insert himself into their lives, usually through work or social connections, then gradually isolate them from their support systems. When the women tried to end the relationships, Wade would escalate, following them, harassing them, sometimes moving to be closer to them. But Brenna had been different. She'd had something the others hadn't, a husband with the skills to fight back. Troy's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Cooper's asking when we can come home. What should I tell him?" Troy typed back, "Tell him Daddy's working on a surprise for the family. Be patient." It wasn't entirely a lie. Troy was working on something for the family. He was working on eliminating the threat that had taken up residence 3 doors down. The doorbell rang upstairs, and Troy checked his security monitors. Wade Hartley stood on his front porch, holding a bottle of wine and wearing what he probably thought was a friendly smile. Troy almost admired the man's audacity. Troy climbed the stairs and opened the door, making sure to appear slightly disheveled and emotionally drained. Exactly what Wade would expect from a man whose wife had just left him. "Wade," Troy said, injecting just the right note of weary resignation into his voice. "What can I do for you?" Wade held up the wine bottle. "Thought you might need some company. Saw Brenna and Cooper leaving with suitcases yesterday. Figured you might be going through a rough patch." The pretense of neighborly concern was almost insulting, but Troy played along. "Yeah, we're having some problems. She took Cooper to her mother's for a few days while we figure things out." Wade's eyes lit up with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Sorry to hear that, man. Marriage is tough. Mind if I come in? Maybe we can talk about it." Troy stepped aside, gesturing Wade into his living room. This was perfect. Wade was making it easy by coming to him. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Beer." "Beer sound great." Troy retrieved 2 bottles from the kitchen, making sure to keep Wade in sight through the pass-through window. When he returned, Wade was studying the family photos on the mantelpiece, particularly the ones of Brenna. "Beautiful woman," Wade said, accepting his beer. "Beautiful family. You're a lucky man." "I thought so." Troy settled into his recliner, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. But apparently luck runs out. Wade sat on the couch, directly across from Troy. He was trying to appear casual, but Troy noticed how his eyes kept scanning the room, cataloging exits and potential weapons. Military training, even abbreviated training, left marks. "You want to talk about what happened?" Wade asked. Sometimes it helps to get a man's perspective. Troy almost smiled at the irony. "She's been having an affair. Found out a couple days ago." He took a long pull of his beer, watching Wade's reaction over the rim of the bottle. Wade's expression was a masterclass in false sympathy. "Damn, that's rough. How'd you find out?" "Phone records. Credit card statements. You know how it is. Once you start looking, the evidence is everywhere." Troy shook his head. 18 months. A whole year and a half of my life was a lie. "Did she say who it was?" Now, Troy did smile, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Some guy from her gym. Said his name was Wade. The beer bottle froze halfway to Wade's lips. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Troy saw the real man underneath. Calculating, dangerous, and now uncertain about how much Troy actually knew. Common name, Wade said carefully. Very common. Made it hard to track him down at first. Troy leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. But I'm pretty good at finding people. It's what I do for a living. Wade set his beer down on the coffee table, and Troy noticed the slight tremor in his hands. What kind of work do you do? Security consulting, risk assessment, background investigations. Troy's smile widened. I help people identify threats before they become problems. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Wade was clearly trying to decide whether Troy was playing games or genuinely didn't know who he was talking to. Troy let him wonder. So what are you going to do? Wade asked finally. About my marriage? Or about the man who destroyed it? Your marriage. Troy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Wade's house. Well, that depends on what this Wade character does next. See, Brenna says the affair is over. Says she chose her family. But I'm wondering if old Wade got the message. Behind him, Troy heard Wade shift on the couch. What do you mean? Troy turned around, and this time he let Wade see exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. The friendly neighbor facade was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. I mean that if some piece of shit thinks he can walk into my life, fuck my wife, corrupt my son, and then stick around to see what else he can take from me. Troy's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Well, that would be a very serious miscalculation on his part. Wade stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket before he caught himself. Troy, I think maybe I should go. You know what's interesting about background investigations? Troy continued, as if Wade hadn't spoken. The things you can learn about a person with just a little bit of effort. Employment history, criminal records, patterns of behavior. Wade's face had gone pale. What are you saying? I'm saying that any man who would move 3 doors down from a woman who's rejected him, that's not normal behavior, Wade. That's predatory behavior. And in my experience, predators don't stop escalating until someone makes them stop. Wade backed toward the door, but Troy didn't move to block his path. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Wade said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. No misunderstanding at all, Troy replied. You moved here because you thought you were dealing with some suburban dad who wouldn't fight back. You thought you could intimidate me into giving up my family. Troy's smile was cold as winter. But here's what you didn't count on, Wade. I'm not some civilian who's going to roll over for you. Wade reached the door and fumbled with the handle. I'm just your neighbor, man. I don't know what you think. Wade, Troy's voice cut through the other man's protests like a blade. Pack your shit and leave town. Tonight. Because if you're still in that house tomorrow morning, I'm going to start treating you like the threat you actually are. Wade fled without another word, practically running across the yard to his house. Troy watched through the window as lights came on throughout Wade's house, seeing the man's silhouette moving frantically from room to room. Troy pulled out his phone and called his old Army buddy, Derek Rodriguez, who now ran a private security firm in Hartford. Derek, it's Troy. I need a favor. How quickly can you get a surveillance team on a house in Millbrook Heights? Full coverage, 24/7. What kind of trouble are you in, brother? Troy watched Wade, loading boxes into his truck under the cover of darkness. The kind that requires professional attention. And Derek? Make sure your guys are armed. Because Troy had been serious about his threat. If Wade Hartley was still there in the morning, Troy was going to stop treating this like a domestic dispute and start treating it like a war. And in war, Troy Kellerman had never lost. Chapter 4. The trap is set. Wade Hartley was still there in the morning. Troy watched from his kitchen window as Wade loaded landscaping equipment from his truck, making a show of beginning work on his front yard. The message was clear. Wade wasn't intimidated. He wasn't leaving. If anything, he was doubling down on his presence in the neighborhood. Derek's surveillance team had confirmed Troy's suspicions throughout the night. Wade had loaded boxes into his truck around midnight, but had never left the property. Instead, he'd unloaded everything before dawn and had spent the early morning hours making obvious preparations to stay. It was a calculated move designed to show Troy that threats wouldn't work. Wade Hartley had just made his second major mistake. Troy's phone rang, and Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. Your boy's got company. Black sedan, 2 occupants, been parked at the end of the street for the past hour. They're watching his house. Can you give me plates? Already ran them. Rental car, paid for with a credit card belonging to Marcus Vega. Troy's blood ran cold. Marcus Vega was a name from Wade's military file, another dishonorably discharged soldier who'd served time for assault and intimidation. If Wade was calling in backup, the situation had just escalated beyond a simple stalking case. How many men can you get me? Troy asked. For what kind of operation? Troy considered his words carefully. Derek was a good friend, but he was also a legitimate businessman who couldn't afford to be associated with anything that crossed certain lines. The kind where everyone goes home safe, but the problem gets permanently resolved. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Troy, you know I can't. Then just maintain surveillance and stay ready to call the cops if things go sideways. Troy ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Vinny? It's Troy Kellerman. I need to call in that favor. Vincent Torino was not a friend in any conventional sense. He was a former Special Forces operator who'd gone into business for himself after discharge, providing services that legitimate security companies couldn't offer. Troy had helped Vinny out of a jam with some drug dealers in Hartford 2 years ago, and Vinny had promised that the debt would be repaid when needed. Troy, my friend, what can I do for you? I need someone to disappear. Permanently. But it has to look accidental. Vinny chuckled. How permanently? Enough to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking about threatening my family. This about the guy who's been fucking your wife. Troy should have been surprised that Vinny already knew, but information was currency in Vinny's world. Him and whoever he's brought with him. 2 for 1. That's gonna cost extra. Money's not an issue. It never is with you, brother. Give me 12 hours to set it up. And Troy, maybe take your family somewhere nice for the weekend. Somewhere with good alibis. After ending the call, Troy walked upstairs to his home office and began making arrangements. Brenna and Cooper would need to stay at her mother's for at least another week, maybe longer. His business had a legitimate consulting contract in Boston that would provide perfect cover for his absence when everything went down. But first, he needed to accelerate Wade's timeline. Troy dressed in his running gear and headed outside for his usual morning jog. As he stretched on his front lawn, he made sure to wave at Wade, who was installing a new mailbox with deliberate, exaggerated care. Beautiful morning, Troy called out cheerfully. Wade looked up, clearly confused by Troy's sudden change in demeanor. Yeah, it is. Troy jogged over, maintaining his friendly neighbor facade. Listen, I wanted to apologize for last night. I was pretty drunk, and I think I might have said some things that didn't make much sense. Wade straightened up, his hand moving instinctively toward the hammer at his belt. Don't worry about it, man. We all have rough nights. The thing is, Brenna told me she might know you from somewhere. Said she recognized your name, but couldn't place it. Troy stretched his hamstring, the picture of casual conversation. You ever go to Fit First downtown? The gym on Harbor Street. Wade's eyes narrowed. Can't say I have. Weird. She was sure she'd seen you there. Troy shrugged. Oh well, probably just one of those faces. Anyway, I should get going. Got a big meeting in Boston this afternoon. Troy jogged away before Wade could respond, but he could feel the man's eyes burning into his back. The seed was planted. Wade now knew that Troy would be out of town, and he also knew that Brenna had been talking about him. Both pieces of information would drive Wade to make his next move faster than he'd originally planned. 3 blocks away, Troy stopped and called Vinny back. Change of plans. Make it look like a breaking gone wrong. Tonight. Tonight? That's awfully fast, even for me. The target just learned that I'll be out of town. He's going to move on my wife and son, probably within the next few hours. I need him taken care of before that happens. What about the backup in the sedan? Troy's smile was cold. What about them? I like the way you think, brother. But that's definitely going to cost extra. Bill me. The rest of the morning passed in careful choreography. Troy made sure to be seen loading his overnight bag into his car, checking his watch, and generally appearing to be in a hurry to leave for his fabricated Boston meeting. Derek's surveillance team confirmed that Wade was watching from his front window, and the men in the sedan had positioned themselves with clear sight lines to both Troy's house and Wade's. At noon, Troy drove away with great fanfare, making sure to wave goodbye to Wade as he passed. But instead of heading toward the interstate, he drove to a storage facility on the other side of town, where he'd rented a unit under a false name 6 months earlier. Inside the unit was everything he'd need for the next 24 hours. Camping gear, freeze-dried food, water, and most importantly, a complete change of clothes and documentation that would place him in Boston should anyone ask questions later. Troy settled in to wait. By his calculations, Wade would make his move sometime after dark. He'd probably try to break into Troy's house first, looking for information about Brenna's whereabouts or evidence of how much Troy actually knew about the affair. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he'd head to Brenna's mother's house. But Wade would never make it that far. Vinny's people were already in position. By tomorrow morning, Wade Hartley and his friend Marcus Vega would be nothing but a memory and a police report about a home invasion gone wrong. Troy's phone buzzed with a text from Brenna. "Cooper wants to know when you're coming to see him. He misses you." Troy stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tell him Daddy's taking care of the bad man. We'll all be together soon." It wasn't a lie. By tomorrow, the threat to his family would be eliminated, and they could begin the process of rebuilding their lives. But first, Troy was going to make sure that Wade Hartley learned what happened when someone threatened what belonged to Troy Kellerman. The lesson would be permanent. Chapter 5, Blood and Consequences. The call came at 3:47 a.m. Troy jerked awake in his storage unit, instantly alert despite having dozed fitfully for only 2 hours. Vinny's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "We have a problem." Troy was already pulling on his boots. "What happened?" "Your boy Wade made his move around midnight, just like you predicted. But when my guys got to his house, they found something else entirely." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that involves federal fucking agents." Troy's blood turned to ice. "Say that again." "DEA had the place under surveillance. Turns out your wife's boyfriend wasn't just some stalker ex. He was running drugs through his construction business, using renovation contracts as cover for moving product. The feds have been watching him for months." Troy closed his eyes, his tactical mind immediately calculating the implications. If Wade was under federal surveillance, then every move Troy had made over the past 3 days was potentially on record. His conversations with Derek, his visit to Vinny, his staged departure for Boston, all of it could be evidence in a federal investigation. "Are your people clear?" "For now. We pulled back when we saw the surveillance van." "But Troy, there's more." Wade and his friend didn't just disappear into the night. They grabbed someone on their way out. "Who?" "Mrs. Chun from the house between yours and Wade's. Elderly Asian woman, lives alone. Looks like they needed a hostage for whatever they're planning next." Troy's jaw clenched. Helen Chun was a 73-year-old widow who brought Cooper cookies every Christmas and kept an eye on the house when Troy and Brenna went out of town. If Wade had escalated to kidnapping innocent neighbors, the situation had spiraled far beyond anything Troy had prepared for. "Where are they now?" "Unknown. But Troy, you need to get back here. The DEA found something else in Wade's house. Photos of your wife, your son, detailed surveillance notes about your family's routine. This guy wasn't just obsessed with Brenna. He was planning something big." Troy was already breaking down his temporary camp, his movements efficient and automatic. "I'm 20 minutes out. And Troy, come armed. Whatever Wade's planning, I don't think he's finished with your family." The drive back to Millbrook Heights passed in a blur of tactical planning and cold fury. Troy had dealt with hostage situations during his military service, but never when his own family was at the center of the threat matrix. Wade had crossed every line by involving Mrs. Chun, and now Troy was going to cross a few lines of his own. The neighborhood was a chaos of flashing lights when Troy arrived. DEA vehicles, local police cruisers, and ambulances lined the street. Derek intercepted him before he could reach his house. "Where the hell have you been?" Derek demanded. "The feds have been looking for you for 3 hours. Boston. I had a consulting meeting." Troy's story was rehearsed and backed by documentation, but he could see skepticism in Derek's eyes. "What's the situation?" "Wade's gone completely off the rails." After he grabbed Mrs. Chun, he called 911 and told them he had explosive devices planted in 3 houses on this street. Yours, his, and the Chun house. Bomb squad's been clearing the area while they search. Troy scanned the controlled chaos around them, his trained eye picking out the federal agents from the local cops. One man in particular caught his attention, a tall, lean agent with prematurely gray hair who was clearly running the operation. "That's Special Agent Morrison," Derek said, following Troy's gaze. "He's been asking a lot of questions about your business, your military background, and your relationship with Wade." "My relationship with Wade? I met the man 3 days ago." That's what I told him. But he seems to think there's more to the story. Before Troy could respond, Agent Morrison approached them. His expression was carefully neutral, but Troy recognized the look of a federal investigator who smelled something rotten. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm Special Agent Morrison, DEA. I need to ask you some questions about Wade Hartley." Troy extended his hand. "Of course, though I'm not sure how much help I can be. I barely knew the man." Morrison didn't shake his hand. "Where were you tonight between midnight and 4 a.m.? "Boston, the Marriott downtown. I can provide receipts if needed." "We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, can you tell me about your conversation with Mr. Hartley yesterday morning?" Troy's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. If the DEA had audio surveillance on Wade's house, they might have recorded parts of their conversation. He needed to be very careful about how much he revealed. He came by with a bottle of wine. Said he wanted to be neighborly. "We talked for maybe 20 minutes. "What did you talk about?" "General stuff. The neighborhood. My family." He asked about my work. Morrison pulled out a small recorder. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to play something for you. This is from a surveillance device we had placed in Mr. Hartley's residence." Wade's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted but audible. "The husband knows. Kellerman figured out about me and Brenna. He's some kind of military contractor or something. Made threats about treating me like a threat." Morrison stopped the recording and looked at Troy. "That doesn't sound like a neighborly conversation about the weather." Troy met his gaze steadily. "Wade Hartley was having an affair with my wife. I confronted him about it and told him to stay away from my family. If that constitutes a threat in your book, Agent Morrison, then I'd suggest you haven't spent much time around men whose wives have been unfaithful." "Did you threaten to kill him?" "I told him to leave town. When someone is stalking your family, Agent Morrison, you make it clear that their behavior won't be tolerated." Morrison studied Troy for a long moment. "Mr. Kellerman, Wade Hartley has been under federal surveillance for the past 4 months as part of a drug trafficking investigation. During that time, we've documented increasingly erratic behavior focused on your wife and son. Photos, surveillance notes, purchases of weapons and surveillance equipment. Yesterday's conversation with you appears to have triggered a complete psychological break." Troy felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of break?" "The kind where he's barricaded himself and an elderly hostage in an abandoned warehouse on the east side, claiming to have enough explosives to level a city block." Morrison's voice was grim. "He's demanding to speak with your wife. Says he wants to explain why he had to take drastic measures to protect her from you." The pieces of Wade's deranged plan finally clicked into place. In his twisted mind, Troy had become the villain, the abusive husband keeping Wade from his true love. Taking Mrs. Chun wasn't just a desperate move. It was Wade's attempt to force a confrontation that would end with Brenna choosing between her husband and an innocent woman's life. "Where's my wife now?" "Safe. We've got her and your son in protective custody until this is resolved." Troy looked around at the organized chaos of the federal response. Bomb squads, SWAT teams, negotiators. All of it focused on containing a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. "Agent Morrison," Troy said carefully, "I think you should know that Wade Hartley isn't just having a psychological break. Based on what I observed yesterday, he's been planning this escalation for weeks, maybe months. The move to this neighborhood, the timing of everything, it's all been leading to this moment." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that your standard hostage negotiation protocols aren't going to work here. Wade doesn't want money or safe passage. He wants my wife to validate his delusion that I'm the problem and he's the solution." And Troy met Morrison's gaze with the steady confidence of a man who'd faced impossible odds before. "And I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to give him what he wants." Chapter 6. Into the Abyss. The abandoned Hartwell manufacturing warehouse squatted on the east side like a cancer, its broken windows and rust-stained walls testament to the industrial decline that had claimed this part of the city. Troy studied the building through binoculars from the DEA command post, noting the tactical challenges it presented. Multiple entry points, high ceiling that would complicate any assault, and too many places for Wade to hide with his hostage. Absolutely not, Agent Morrison said when Troy finished outlining his plan. You're a civilian, Mr. Kellerman. This is a federal operation. Troy lowered the binoculars and turned to face the federal agent. Agent Morrison, I spent 8 years in special forces conducting exactly these kinds of operations. I know building assault tactics better than most of your SWAT team. And more importantly, I'm the only person Wade Hartley wants to talk to. Wade wants to talk to your wife, not you. Wade wants to prove that he's the better man, that he can protect Brenna from the terrible husband who threatens innocent neighbors. Troy's voice was cold with calculation. He's not going to hurt Mrs. Chun as long as he thinks there's a chance to win this confrontation. But if your negotiators keep stalling, if he starts to realize that Brenna isn't coming, he's going to start making good on his threats about those explosives. Morrison consulted with his team leader, a conversation Troy couldn't hear but could read in their body language. The federal agents were out of options, and everyone knew it. Wade had been clear in his demands. Bring Brenna Kellerman to the warehouse, alone, or he would detonate the devices he claimed to have rigged throughout the building. Even if I agreed to this insane plan, Morrison said finally, what makes you think you can succeed where trained negotiators have failed? Troy picked up the tactical vest Derek had brought him from his storage unit. Because Wade Hartley thinks he's the hero of this story, Agent Morrison. He thinks he's rescuing a woman from an abusive husband and protecting her from a man who makes threats against innocent neighbors. Troy strapped on the vest with practiced efficiency. But when I walk into that warehouse, he's going to realize he's not the hero. He's not even the victim. He's just another predator who picked the wrong family to fuck with. The plan was simple, which made it both elegant and dangerous. Troy would approach the warehouse openly, wearing civilian clothes over his tactical vest. He would be wired for sound, but otherwise unarmed, at least visibly. Wade would see him coming and would make the natural assumption that Brenna had sent her husband instead of coming herself. What Wade wouldn't see was Derek's team positioned around the building's perimeter, or the federal agents ready to move on Troy's signal. He also wouldn't see the ceramic knife strapped to Troy's ankle, or the flashbang grenades disguised as cell phones in his jacket pockets. Remember, Morrison said as Troy prepared to leave the command post, we need Wade alive. He's got information about a drug network that spans 3 states. Troy's smile was sharp as a blade. I'll do my best. The walk to the warehouse felt like every patrol Troy had ever taken in hostile territory, hyper-aware of every shadow, every potential shooting position, every escape route. The building loomed larger as he approached, its broken windows like dead eyes watching his advance. Troy's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. Wade's got Mrs. Chun in what looks like an office space. Troy clicked his radio twice to acknowledge and pushed through the warehouse's main entrance. The interior was a cavern of shadows and rust, broken machinery scattered across a concrete floor that echoed with every footstep. Graffiti covered the walls, and the smell of decay and neglect permeated everything. Wait, Troy called out, his voice carrying through the empty space. It's Troy Kellerman. Brenna sent me. Silence for nearly 30 seconds. Then Wade's voice drifted down from somewhere above. Where is she? I told them I wanted to talk to Brenna. She's scared, Wade. Scared of what this has become. Troy moved deeper into the warehouse, following a set of metal stairs toward the 2nd floor. She asked me to come instead, to hear what you have to say. She should be here herself. Wade's voice cracked with emotion and frustration. She needs to understand what you've done to us. Troy reached the 2nd floor landing and could see lights spilling from a doorway at the far end of a corridor lined with abandoned offices. What I've done. Wade, I think we need to talk about what you've done. I protected her. I gave her what she needed when her own husband was too busy playing soldier to notice she was dying inside. Troy moved slowly down the corridor, his every sense alert for signs of explosives or booby traps. Through his earpiece, he He could hear Morrison coordinating with the SWAT team, preparing for multiple entry points once Troy gave the signal. "Is that what you told yourself?" Troy called out. "That you were protecting her?" "I loved her." The desperation in Wade's voice was unmistakable now. "I love her. More than you ever could." Troy reached the doorway and could see into the office space. Wade stood near a broken window, his arm around Mrs. Chin's frail shoulders. The elderly woman was trembling, but appeared unharmed. Wade held a pistol in his free hand, but it was pointed toward the floor rather than at his hostage. More importantly, Troy could see the explosive devices Wade had rigged around the room. Crude but potentially effective pipe bombs connected by visible wiring to a dead man's switch in Wade's left hand. "Hello, Wade," Troy said, stepping into the doorway with his hands raised. "Mrs. Chun, are you all right?" The elderly woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm okay, Troy, but he says he's going to hurt people if Brenna doesn't come." "Brenna's not coming," Troy said, his eyes locked on Wade's face. "But I'm here, and I think it's time you and I had an honest conversation about what this is really about." Wade's grip tightened on both the pistol and the dead man's switch. "This is about love, Troy. Something you obviously don't understand." "Love." Troy stepped further into the room, calculating angles and distances. "Wade, let me tell you what I see. I see a man who stalked a married woman for 18 months. A man who manipulated her into an affair while she was dealing with postpartum depression. A man who involved her 9-year-old son in his deception. A man who moved 3 doors down from her family when she tried to end things." Troy's voice hardened. "That's not love, Wade. That's obsession. That's predatory behavior. You don't know anything." Wade's face flushed with anger. "You were never there for her. Always working, always traveling, always putting your business ahead of your family." "You're right," Troy said, and Wade blinked in surprise. "I wasn't there enough. I was building a business, trying to provide for my family, and I missed the signs that my wife was struggling. That's on me." Troy took another step closer. "But here's the difference between you and me, Wade. When I realized I'd failed my family, I tried to fix it. When you realized Brenna didn't want you anymore, you decided to take her by force." Wade's hand was shaking now, both from emotion and from the weight of the dead man's switch. "She does want me. She just doesn't understand that you're the problem." "Then why isn't she here, Wade?" Troy's voice was almost gentle now. "If she really wanted you, if she really believed I was the problem, why did she choose to stay with me instead of running away with you 6 months ago?" The question hit Wade like a physical blow. His face crumpled with the realization that his entire delusion was built on a foundation of wishful thinking and self-deception. "Because you threatened her," Wade whispered. "Because you made her afraid of what you'd do." Troy shook his head sadly. "No, Wade. Because she realized that what happened between you two wasn't love. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness that she regretted the moment it started getting serious." "You're lying. Ask Mrs. Chun," Troy said, nodding toward the elderly woman. "She sees everything that happens in our neighborhood. She's watched my family for years. Ask her if she's ever seen me raise my voice to my wife. Ask her if she's ever seen any signs that Brenna was afraid of me." Mrs. Chun looked between Troy and Wade, understanding what Troy was trying to do. "Brenna was never afraid of Troy," she said softly. "She was afraid of you. She told me you wouldn't leave her alone after she ended things." Wade's carefully constructed reality was crashing down around him, and Troy could see the exact moment when the man's last shred of self-control snapped. "No!" Wade screamed, raising the pistol toward Troy. But Troy had been ready for this moment since entering the warehouse. As Wade's hand came up, Troy was already moving, diving toward the window while simultaneously triggering the flashbang grenade in his jacket pocket. The explosion of light and sound disoriented everyone in the room, but Troy's military training had prepared him for the sensory overload. He rolled to his feet, drew the ceramic knife from his ankle, and was on Wade before the man could recover from the flashbang's effects. The knife went in just below Wade's ribs, angled upward toward his heart. Wade's eyes went wide with shock and pain, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed. "That's for threatening my family," Troy whispered in Wade's ear as the man's life ebbed away. Troy quickly checked Mrs. Chun, shaken but unharmed, and then carefully examined the dead man's switch. It was a simple pressure device that would detonate the explosives if released. Troy held it steady while calling for the bomb squad through his radio. "Target is down," he reported to Morrison. "Hostage is safe, but we still have active explosives in here." As federal agents flooded into the warehouse, Troy remained calm and professional, following all protocols for evidence preservation and hostage safety. To any observer, it looked like a textbook resolution to a hostage situation, a civilian who'd gotten lucky during a desperate struggle with an unstable kidnapper. Only Troy knew that there had been nothing lucky about it. Wade Hartley had finally learned what happened when someone threatened what belonged to Troy Kellerman. The lesson had been permanent. Chapter 7. Reckoning. 3 days after the warehouse incident, Troy sat in a sterile federal interview room, facing Agent Morrison across a metal table. The room was windowless and gray, designed to make suspects uncomfortable, but Troy had been in far worse places during his military service. He sipped black coffee from a foam cup and waited for Morrison to begin what he knew would be a carefully orchestrated interrogation. The knife wound was very precise, Morrison said, opening a thick file folder. One thrust, angled upward between the ribs, piercing the heart. That's the kind of wound you see from someone with combat training. Troy met Morrison's gaze steadily. Wade Hartley was pointing a gun at me and threatening to detonate explosives that could have killed Mrs. Chun and half your federal agents. I did what I had to do to protect innocent lives. Except the ME's report shows that Wade was stabbed from behind, not during a frontal struggle. The flashbang disoriented everyone in that room, Agent Morrison. I'm not sure anyone could reconstruct the exact sequence of events with complete accuracy. Morrison pulled out a photograph, a crime scene shot showing Wade's body positioned near the window. Wade's blood spatter pattern suggests he was facing away from you when the knife went in. That's not consistent with your statement about a struggle for the gun. Troy leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Are you suggesting that I murdered Wade Hartley in cold blood, Agent Morrison? Because if that's your theory, I'd like to know what evidence you have beyond blood spatter analysis that could have multiple interpretations. Morrison stared at him for a long moment before pulling out another folder. Let's talk about Vincent Torino. Troy's expression didn't change, but he felt a familiar chill. Vinny was supposed to have stayed completely off the radar during this operation. Vincent Torino is a convicted felon who runs a questionable security company out of Hartford. Morrison continued. Phone records show that you called his number twice in the 24 hours before Wade's death. What did you discuss? Vincent Torino occasionally provides subcontractor services for my legitimate security consulting business. I called him about a potential job in Boston. A job that never materialized. Not all business inquiries result in contracts, Agent Morrison. Morrison opened the second folder and spread several surveillance photos across the table. The images showed Troy at the storage facility, Vinny's men conducting reconnaissance around Wade's house, and other activities that painted a picture of coordinated planning. We've been watching Vincent Torino for months as part of a separate investigation, Morrison said. Imagine our surprise when you appeared in our surveillance photos. Troy studied the images with professional interest. The surveillance had been comprehensive, but not perfect. There were gaps that a good defense attorney could exploit, and the photos themselves were circumstantial at best. Agent Morrison, are you charging me with a crime? Because if not, I think this conversation is over. Morrison gathered up the photos and files. Walk me through it, Mr. Kellerman. The real version. Troy considered his options. Morrison was clearly fishing, trying to get him to volunteer information that the federal investigation hadn't been able to prove conclusively. The smart play was to remain silent and demand a lawyer. But Troy had been thinking about something Mrs. Chun had said in the warehouse. She told me you wouldn't leave her alone after she ended things. The elderly woman had been talking about Brenna's fears regarding Wade, but the words applied equally to Morrison's investigation. Sometimes the only way to end a threat was to meet it head on. You want the real version? Troy asked. Here it is. Wade Hartley was a predator who targeted my wife when she was vulnerable. He manipulated her into an affair, involved my son in his deception, and then escalated to stalking and kidnapping when she tried to end things. Your federal investigation gave him cover to continue his obsessive behavior because you needed him operational for your drug case. Morrison's eyes narrowed. We had no idea about his fixation on your family until... Bullshit. Troy's voice cut through Morrison's protest like a blade. You had surveillance on Wade for months. You knew about the affair. You knew about his escalating behavior. You knew he was taking photos of my wife and son and planning something that was way outside the scope of your drug investigation. But you let it continue because Wade was useful to you. The accusation hung in the air between them, and Troy could see from Morrison's expression that he'd hit close to the mark. So yes, Troy continued, when I realized that federal law enforcement wasn't going to protect my family from your confidential informant, I made other arrangements. I called Vincent Torino because I needed professional advice about how to handle a threat that was escalating beyond civilian capabilities. And when Wade took an innocent elderly woman hostage and started making threats about explosives, I eliminated that threat using the skills the United States Army taught me. Morrison sat back in his chair. You're admitting to premeditated murder. I'm admitting to protecting my family from a dangerous predator that your investigation enabled and protected. Troy stood up slowly. And unless you're prepared to charge me with a crime, Agent Morrison, this conversation is over. Troy walked toward the door, but Morrison's voice stopped him. Your wife knows. Troy turned around slowly. Knows what? Brenna knows that Wade's death wasn't self-defense during a struggle. She's seen the crime scene photos, read the ME's report. She knows you killed him deliberately. Morrison's smile was cold. She also knows about your phone calls to Vincent Torino, about your stage trip to Boston, about all of it. For the first time since the warehouse incident, Troy felt genuinely surprised. Where is she now? Protective custody, along with your son. They're safe, but they're also trying to process the fact that you're not the man they thought you were. Troy's jaw clenched. I'm exactly the man I've always been, Agent Morrison. I'm a man who protects his family from threats. If that makes me a monster in your book, then we have very different definitions of morality. What happens now? Morrison asked. Troy considered the question carefully. His family's safety had been his primary concern throughout this entire ordeal, but he'd always known that eliminating Wade might come with consequences beyond federal investigation. Brenna's reaction to learning the truth about his actions was a variable he'd calculated but hoped to avoid. Now, Troy said finally, I go home and have a conversation with my wife about what kind of man she married and what kind of life she wants to live going forward. And if she can't accept what you did, Troy's expression was as cold and unforgiving as winter. Then she'll discover that Wade hardly wasn't the only person in her life who underestimated Troy Kellerman. Morrison stood up abruptly. Are you threatening your wife, Mr. Kellerman? I'm simply observing that people who betray my trust tend to face consequences for their choices. Troy opened the door and paused. Ask Vincent Torino what happened to the last person who thought they could play games with my family and walk away unscathed. Troy left the federal building knowing that Morrison would investigate that threat and discover that there was no record of anyone else meeting an unfortunate end after crossing Troy Kellerman. But the seed of doubt was planted, and sometimes doubt was more effective than certainty. Because the truth was that Troy had never killed anyone before Wade Hartley. But he discovered that he was very, very good at it. And if his wife couldn't accept the man she'd married, she would learn just how good at it he really was. Chapter 8. The Judgment. Troy found Brenna and Cooper at her mother's house in West Hartford, a modest colonial that had always felt like a sanctuary from the complications of adult life. But as he stood on the familiar front porch, Troy realized that there would be no sanctuary from what was coming next. Eleanor Hoffman answered the door, her face a mask of carefully controlled hostility. Troy's mother-in-law had never particularly liked him. Too intense, too secretive about his work, too much like the soldiers she'd grown up around during her father's military career. But now her dislike had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. She doesn't want to see you, Eleanor said without preamble. That's not her decision to make. Troy's voice was calm, but there was an undertone that made Eleanor step back involuntarily. She's my wife. Cooper is my son. We're going to have a conversation. Troy, please, Eleanor said, her voice pleading now. Just leave them alone. Haven't you done enough damage? Troy studied his mother-in-law's face, noting the fear in her eyes. Morrison had been thorough in briefing Brenna about the federal investigation's findings. The family knew exactly what Troy was capable of, and they were afraid of him. Good. Fear would make the next conversation more honest. Where are they? Troy asked. Eleanor reluctantly led him through the house to the backyard, where Brenna sat on a wooden swing set that Cooper had outgrown years ago. Their son was nowhere to be seen, probably upstairs in his grandmother's guest room, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. Brenna looked up as Troy approached, and he saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before. Not just fear, but a kind of revulsion that cut deeper than any federal interrogation could have managed. Hello, Brenna. She didn't respond, just stared at him with those green eyes that had once looked at him with love and now reflected nothing but horror. Troy sat down on the swing next to hers, the chains creaking under his weight. We need to talk. About what? Brenna's voice was barely above a whisper. About how you murdered Wade in cold blood. About how you've been planning it for days. About how you lied to federal agents and manipulated everyone around you to cover up what you did. About how I eliminated a threat to our family. Brenna laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. A threat? Troy, Wade was in federal custody. The DEA was going to arrest him as soon as they finished their investigation. He was going to prison for years. You didn't need to kill him. Troy turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Wade Hartley kidnapped an innocent elderly woman and threatened to blow up half the East Side. He was obsessed with you to the point of psychosis. Even if he'd gone to prison, he would have gotten out eventually. And when he did, he would have come for you and Cooper again. So you appointed yourself judge and executioner. I appointed myself protector of my family, which is what I've always been, Brenna. The only difference is that now you know what that sometimes requires. Brenna stood up abruptly, pacing away from the swing set. I don't know who you are. I thought I married a good man, a protector, someone who would keep Cooper and me safe. But not like this. Not by becoming a killer. Troy remained seated, watching his wife struggle with the reality of who he'd always been. I've been a killer since I was 22 years old, Brenna. The Army taught me how to eliminate threats efficiently and without remorse. My business exists because there are people in this world who understand that sometimes violence is the only solution to certain problems. That's different. That was war. That was exactly the same. Troy's voice hardened. The only difference is the uniform and the flag. Wade Hartley declared war on our family the moment he decided to stalk you and involve our son in his obsession. I ended that war the way wars are always ended, by destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. Brenna stopped pacing and turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Cooper saw the news reports, Troy. He knows that Wade is dead. He's asking questions about what happened, and I don't know what to tell him. Tell him the truth. Tell him that his father protected him from a bad man who wanted to hurt our family. How do I explain that his father is a murderer? Troy stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had made life and death decisions in situations where hesitation meant death. You don't get to judge me, Brenna. You don't get to take the moral high ground after you brought this threat into our lives in the first place. Wade Hartley found our family because you opened the door for him. You gave him access to our home, our routine, our son. You created this situation with your affair, and I cleaned up the mess. Brenna's face flushed with anger. I made a mistake. I had an affair, and I ended it when I realized what I was doing. But that doesn't justify murder. Your mistake almost got Cooper killed, Troy said, his voice rising for the first time. Your mistake put an innocent elderly woman in the hospital with trauma that she'll never fully recover from. Your mistake brought a drug dealer and would-be kidnapper into our neighborhood. So don't you dare stand there and lecture me about proportional response. They stared at each other across the yard. 13 years of marriage reduced to this moment of absolute judgment. Troy could see Brenna making her decision, weighing her fear of him against her love for their son and her own moral compass. I want a divorce, she said finally. Troy nodded slowly. I thought you might. And I want full custody of Cooper. I don't want him around you anymore. I don't want him to think that what you did was acceptable." Now Troy's expression shifted, becoming something cold and predatory that made Brenna take an involuntary step backward. "That's not going to happen," he said quietly. "Troy, you can't." "I can't what?" "I can't protect my son from a mother who has such poor judgment that she nearly got him killed. I can't ensure that Cooper grows up understanding that sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect the people they love." Troy moved closer, and Brenna backed against the house. "You seem to be confused about how this is going to work, Brenna. I'll call the police. I'll tell them you're threatening me." Troy's smile was cold as death. "And tell them what? That your husband eliminated a threat to your family, and now you're having second thoughts about being married to someone competent enough to keep you safe." He shook his head. "Agent Morrison would love to hear that conversation." Brenna's voice was shaking now. "What do you want?" "I want my family back. I want my wife to understand that everything I did was to protect her and our son. And I want Cooper to grow up with a father who will teach him how to be strong enough to handle whatever threatens the people he loves. And if I can't accept that," Troy considered the question with the same methodical approach he'd used to plan Wade's elimination. Brenna was the mother of his child, but she was also a security risk now. She knew too much about his capabilities and his willingness to use them. If she couldn't be trusted to keep the family's secrets, she would have to be managed like any other threat. "Then you'll discover that Wade Hartley wasn't the first person to underestimate what I'm willing to do to protect what's mine," Troy said finally. "And unlike Wade, you won't get a warning." The threat hung in the air between them, explicit and unmistakable. Brenna understood that her choices had been reduced to two options: accept her husband for what he was, or face the consequences of betraying him. "I need time to think," she whispered. Troy nodded. "You have until tomorrow morning." "But Brenna?" He paused at the gate. "Cooper comes home with me tonight. Because whatever you decide about our marriage, he's my son, and I protect what's mine." Troy walked back through the house, past Eleanor's terrified face, and climbed the stairs to the guest room where Cooper was hiding. His son looked up from a comic book, his young face still bearing traces of the trauma from recent events. "Hey, buddy," Troy said gently. "Ready to come home?" Cooper nodded and began packing his few belongings. As they prepared to leave, the boy looked up at his father with the kind of direct honesty that only children possessed. "Daddy, did you kill the bad man?" Troy knelt down to Cooper's eye level, looking into eyes that were so much like his own. "Yes, son, I did." "Good," Cooper said simply. "He was going to hurt Mom and Mrs. Chun." Troy felt something warm and fierce bloom in his chest. His son understood what Brenna couldn't, that some threats could only be ended with finality. As they drove home together, Troy realized that whatever Brenna decided, he'd already won the most important battle. Cooper would grow up knowing that his father was someone who could be counted on to eliminate any threat to their family. And that lesson would serve the boy well in the years to come. Chapter 9. The New Order. 6 months later, Troy stood in the kitchen of his Millbrook Heights home, watching Cooper practice soccer in the backyard. The boy had grown taller over the summer, his movements more confident and assured. The trauma of Wade Hartley's obsession had faded, replaced by the quiet security that came from knowing his father was someone who could handle any threat. Brenna had made her choice, as Troy had known she would. She'd returned home the morning after their conversation at her mother's house, pale and shaken, but resolute. The divorce papers had never been filed. Cooper had never spent another night away from home, and Brenna had never again questioned Troy's methods or judgment. The marriage had changed, of course. The easy intimacy they'd once shared was gone, replaced by something more formal and careful. Brenna no longer looked at Troy with love, but she looked at him with respect and a healthy dose of fear. She understood now that her husband was not a man to be trifled with, betrayed, or underestimated. And that understanding had made their home more peaceful than it had been in years. The doorbell rang, and Troy walked through the house to answer it. Agent Morrison stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man who'd come to deliver unpleasant news. "Agent Morrison," Troy said, opening the door wider. "This is unexpected. Mr. Kellerman, I have some news about the Wade Hartley investigation." Troy gestured Morrison into the living room, noting how the federal agent's eyes swept the space with professional interest. The family photos on the mantelpiece had been rearranged. Images of Brenna's affair had been carefully edited from their domestic narrative, leaving only pictures that showed the Kellerman family as a united front. "Coffee?" Troy asked. "No, thank you. This won't take long." Morrison settled into the same chair Wade had occupied during their final conversation. "The DEA has officially closed the Wade Hartley case. Self-defense during the protection of a hostage. No charges will be filed." Troy's expression didn't change, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. Morrison had spent months trying to build a case for premeditated murder, but the evidence had never been strong enough to overcome the basic facts. Wade had been an armed kidnapper threatening innocent lives, and Troy had eliminated that threat during a dynamic tactical situation. "I appreciate you coming by to let me know personally," Troy said. Morrison opened the manila envelope and pulled out several photographs, surveillance shots showing Troy at various locations around the city over the past 6 months. "These are interesting, don't you think?" Troy studied the images with professional interest. Morrison's people had been watching him closely, documenting his meetings with clients, his visits to the gun range, his occasional dinners with Vincent Torino. All perfectly legal activities, but the message was clear. The federal government was keeping tabs on Troy Kellerman. "Interesting how?" Troy asked. "3 of your business clients have reported workplace accidents involving employees who'd been skimming money or threatening to report safety violations to federal regulators. A man who'd been harassing one of your female clients had his car run off the road during an apparent mechanical failure. A drug dealer who'd been operating near Cooper's elementary school overdosed on his own product." Morrison gathered up the photos. "Statistically, it's remarkable how many problems seem to resolve themselves around people who've hired your security consulting services." Troy's smile was thin and cold. "I provide very thorough security assessments, Agent Morrison. When clients understand the full scope of threats they're facing, they're able to make informed decisions about how to protect themselves. And if those decisions happen to result in the elimination of threats through convenient accidents, I'm not responsible for the choices my clients make after receiving my professional recommendations." Morrison stood up, his frustration evident. "You're running a murder-for-hire operation disguised as a security consulting business. I'm running a legitimate business that helps people identify and address security vulnerabilities." Troy's voice remained level and professional. "If you have evidence of criminal activity, Agent Morrison, I suggest you file charges. Otherwise, these fishing expeditions are starting to feel like harassment." Morrison walked toward the door, but paused in the hallway. "What happened to Wade Hartley changed you, didn't it? You discovered that you enjoyed killing." Troy considered the question honestly. Wade's death had been necessary, but Morrison was right about one thing. Troy had discovered something about himself during that warehouse confrontation. He'd learned that he was exceptionally good at eliminating threats, and that knowledge had opened up new possibilities for his business. "What happened to Wade Hartley taught me that some problems require permanent solutions," Troy said finally, "and that there are people in this world who are willing to pay for those solutions." "And your family? How do they feel about what you've become?" Troy glanced toward the kitchen window, where he could see Brenna preparing dinner while keeping one eye on Cooper's soccer practice. His wife moved through her domestic routine with quiet efficiency, no longer the carefree woman he'd married, but someone more careful and aware of the complexities of the world they lived in. "My family understands that their safety and security are my primary concerns," Troy said. "They understand that I'm someone who can be counted on to handle any threat that emerges. And they understand that loyalty and discretion are rewarded, while betrayal and carelessness have consequences." Morrison shook his head. "You've turned your own family into hostages. I've turned my family into people who understand how the world actually works." Troy opened the front door, his message clear that the conversation was over. "Good day, Agent Morrison." After Morrison left, Troy returned to the kitchen where Brenna was cutting vegetables for a salad. She looked up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "What did he want?" she asked. "To let us know that the Wade Hartley investigation is officially closed." Brenna nodded and returned to her food preparation. Over the past 6 months, She learned not to ask too many questions about Troy's business or the various news reports about accidents and overdoses that seemed to cluster around his clients. She'd learned that ignorance was safer than knowledge, and that her husband's protection came with a price that was easier to pay if she didn't examine it too closely. "Cooper wants to know if he can have a friend over for dinner this weekend," Brenna said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Which friend?" "Tyler Morrison. His father works for the government." Troy's smile was genuinely amused. "Agent Morrison's son? That's interesting. Should I tell Cooper no?" Troy considered the request carefully. Having Morrison's child in his home would be an interesting psychological pressure on the federal agent. It would also give Troy an opportunity to observe the Morrison family dynamics and potentially gather intelligence about ongoing federal investigations. "Tell Cooper yes," Troy said finally. "I think it would be good for him to have friends whose fathers understand the importance of protecting their families." That evening, after Cooper had gone to bed and Brenna had retired to their bedroom, Troy sat in his home office reviewing files for new clients. His business had grown significantly since the Wade Hartley incident, as word spread through certain circles about the thoroughness of his security assessments and the finality of his problem-solving methods. The phone rang, and Troy recognized the number as belonging to a prominent Hartford businessman whose wife had been receiving threatening letters from a former employee. "Mr. Kellerman? This is Richard Chun. I believe you know my Aunt Helen." Troy leaned back in his chair, remembering the elderly woman Wade had kidnapped. "Hello, Mr. Chun. How is Mrs. Chun doing?" "Better, thanks to you. She speaks very highly of how you handled that situation." Richard's voice carried the kind of careful respect that came from understanding exactly what Troy was capable of. "I have a problem that might benefit from your particular expertise." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that requires a permanent solution." Troy pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. Outside his office window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, full of families who slept safely because men like Troy Kellerman were willing to do what was necessary to maintain order in an increasingly chaotic world. "Tell me about it," Troy said, and began planning another solution to another problem. Because that's what he did now. That's what he'd always done, really, but now he did it for profit instead of patriotism. And business was very, very good. In the end, Wade Hartley had given Troy something valuable. The knowledge that he was exceptionally skilled at eliminating threats, and that there were people willing to pay handsomely for those skills. Troy Kellerman had found his true calling, and anyone who threatened what was his would learn, as Wade had learned, that some lessons were permanent. The neighborhood remained peaceful. The family remained protected. And Troy remained exactly what he'd always been, a man who finished what others started, forever and always. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.